She was 19 and unmoored. No bed, no address, no one willing to say her name with care, just a canvas roll of worn wood-carving tools and $41 she had counted 3 times under a bus station clock. And with that money she bought a rusted Carousel Pavilion on the north edge of Ocean City, Worcester County, Maryland, a place the county said had fallen off public maps in 1988. One wall had buckled where the salt wind had found it. The roof let rain through in 6 deliberate places. The county said the building had been closed since 1988 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the hollow belly of the lead horse, behind a sealed cedar compartment that had not been opened in over 35 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Maeve Elowen Callahan had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had waited in rooms where adults lowered their voices when she entered. She had waited on porch steps with her knees pulled under her chin, watching other families move through yellow squares of kitchen light. She had waited beside her father's workbench while glue dried, while varnish cleared, while rain went down the gutters of a narrow house that smelled of shavings, cold coffee, and beeswax. Her father used to tell her that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. His name was Daniel Callahan, and he had broad carpenter's hands with pale scars over the knuckles, the kind a man earns from giving his patience to wood instead of his temper to people. He repaired porch railings, church pews, cracked banisters, broken toys, and, when the county fair came through each August, he mended the carved panels on the travelling merry-go-round that parked for 1 week beside the VFW hall. Maeve learned early that wood had directions it preferred. A blade pushed wrong would chatter and tear. A blade held honest and exact would whisper. She learned to read the grain before she read most books, pressing her finger along the darker lines in pine or maple while her father stood over her and made no hurry of the lesson. Their house sat 3 blocks from the bay, not in the charming part people photographed, but on a street where paint blistered and crab traps leaned against chain-link fences. In winter, the salt came all the way into the rooms. It crusted the window tracks and stiffened the latch on the back door. Her mother, Linnea, kept a folded towel at the sill and changed it every morning before work, as if the sea were a guest that could be managed by manners. Linnea was a careful woman with auburn hair she pinned tight at the nape of her neck. She worked at the front desk of a dental office and came home smelling faintly of peppermint gloves. She made soup stretch farther than soup had any right to stretch. She did not complain when Daniel's work came late or when a customer paid in crumpled bills and apologies. Yet there was something in Linnea that bent toward safety before it bent toward love, and Maeve as a child noticed this without having the language for it. Daniel was different. He had a way of living that made ordinary objects seem entrusted to him. He could lift a chipped chair from the curb and see where a rung belonged. He could hold a cracked wooden duck in both hands and know that some child had once loved it enough to wear the paint from its beak. He never called anything worthless until he had turned it over twice. On Saturdays, when Maeve was small enough to stand on an apple crate, Daniel took her across the bridge to visit his great-uncle, Silas Callahan, who lived in a weathered cottage behind a shuttered bait shop near West Ocean City. The cottage leaned inland, away from the weather, with a tin roof that rang under gull feet. People in town said Silas had carved horses once. Not toys, not porch decorations, real carousel horses, tall as ponies, with glass eyes and arched necks and manes that seemed to have been caught by wind. By the time Maeve knew him, Silas was already old, though not fragile. He had a narrow face, white brows, and hands so steady they looked separate from his age. His left ear had been nearly ruined by the noise of machines in some former life, so Maeve learned to stand on his right side when she asked a question. He wore a grey wool vest in every season and kept his carving knives wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the kitchen table where other men might have kept newspapers. The weekend ritual never changed. Daniel knocked twice, then once. Silas opened the door without greeting them, only stepping aside as though they had returned from an errand, instead of crossing several miles. Maeve would wash her hands at the enamel basin, dry them on the flour sack towel by the stove, and sit at the table while Silas laid out the tools one by one. Gouge, viner, skew chisel, V-tool, mallet, rasp. He named each object as if introducing relatives. There was always tea gone dark on the stove, and there was always a pan of cornbread under a cloth. Though Silas claimed he did not bake for visitors, outside marsh grass rattled when the wind turned. Inside, the only clock was missing its minute hand, so the afternoon passed by light, not by number. Silas did not teach like school teachers. He gave Maeve a scrap of basswood and told her to make a leaf. When she made the stem too deep, she said nothing. He took the piece, held it under the window, and tilted it so the tear caught the light. Then he set it back in front of her. That was enough. Shame did not enter the room, only evidence. As she grew older, the scraps became rosettes, scrolls, feathers, then the difficult curve of a horse's lower eyelid. Silas kept a drawer of glass eyes wrapped in yellowed tissue, brown, black, blue. One pair, an odd green that made Maeve uneasy if she looked at them too long. He showed her how a carved animal needed more silence than motion. "The body can leap," he said once, tapping the flank of an unfinished horse with the handle of a knife, "but the eye has to know why." That was the quote Maeve carried even when she did not understand it. The body can leap, but the eye has to know why. For years she took it to mean that a good carving needed intention. Later, after the harder seasons had moved through her life and left their marks, she understood he had been speaking of people too. Motion was easy. Leaving was easy. Running, signing, selling, closing a door. Boarding a bus with a throat too tight for speech. But knowing why required a different honesty. It required sitting still long enough for the truth to stop defending itself. Silas had one locked cabinet in the back room. It was black walnut, plain, and always dusted. Maeve once asked what was inside it. Silas looked toward Daniel, and Daniel looked out the window. That was the end of the question. From then on she understood there were parts of the Callahan name that adults handled like thin glass. When Maeve was 11, Daniel began teaching her the mechanical side of things, not engines, not cars, but gears, shafts, bearings, springs, counterweights, and the patient grammar of wheels turning other wheels. He brought home broken clocks from estate sales and set them on the kitchen table. Together they opened the backs and studied the brass guts of them. Teeth meshed, pins lifted, weights pulled, nothing moved alone. "You carve the skin," Daniel told her, setting a brass gear in her palm. "But if you don't understand what moves beneath it, you are only making a pretty shell." He let her clean pivots with toothpicks. He let her oil bearings with the tip of a sewing needle. He taught her to listen for strain, the uneven click that meant a wheel had lost its clean path. By 13, Maeve could take apart a music box and put it back together without a leftover screw. By 14, she had carved a small horse from a block of maple, then built a crude cam beneath it, so the horse rose and fell when she turned a handle. It bumped badly. Silas watched it for a long time. "Honest start," he said. Those 2 words fed her for months. The losses began in a season of fog. First Daniel developed a cough that he blamed on damp houses and sanding dust. Then he stopped climbing ladders. Then he sat at the workbench longer than he worked at it, his thumb resting on the spine of a chisel, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond the window. Maeve was 16 when he died before dawn in a hospital room, painted a colour no one would willingly choose. Linnea stood with both hands around a paper cup of water. Silas came late, wearing his grey vest over a shirt buttoned wrong, and placed Daniel's favourite gouge in Maeve's coat pocket without a word. After the funeral, people brought casseroles, then advice, then nothing. Bills remained. The house changed. Linnea spoke of practical matters in a voice that sounded borrowed. The workbench was cleared one drawer at a time. Daniel's clamps went first, then his planes, then the clock parts sorted into coffee tins. Some were sold, some were given to men who said they would make good use of them, and then tossed them into pickup beds without wrapping the edges. Silas tried to stop it. Maeve saw him once in the yard, one hand on the bed of a truck, speaking in a low voice to her mother. Linnea shook her head without looking at him. That evening, Silas drove away with the locked black walnut cabinet strapped upright in the back of his old station wagon. Maeve watched from the upstairs window, pressing her knuckles against the glass. A year later, Silas fell on the back step of his cottage, After a winter rain glazed the boards, he lived 3 more days. Maeve visited him once in the hospital. His right hand moved under the blanket, searching for a tool that was not there. When she placed her fingers in his palm, he gripped them so firmly that the nurse turned from the chart. "Do not let them call it junk," he said. Those were the last words he spoke to her. After he died, the cottage was cleared with a speed that made Maeve feel breathless. She was still 17, still legally tangled in other people's decisions. A distant cousin signed papers. A man from a salvage company came with a box truck. The black walnut cabinet disappeared. So did the glass eyes, the oiled cloth rolls, the unfinished horse heads, the tracing papers, the patterns marked in Silas's narrow hand. Maeve found only one thing left behind. A thin curl of maple under the kitchen table, shaped like a comma. She put it in her coat pocket and kept it there until it broke. Her Aunt Ruth arrived that spring with lipstick too red for daylight and shoes that made sharp sounds in the hall. Ruth was Linnea's older sister, though she carried herself like someone who had promoted herself out of kinship. She lived inland in a townhouse with white carpet and a glass coffee table no one was allowed to set a cup on. She had opinions about the neighbourhood, the house, Daniel's debts, Maeve's clothes, Linnea's softness, and the dead weight of sentiment. Ruth did not shout. That would have been easier to resist. She spoke in a smooth, lowered voice, smoothing the table with her fingertips while she explained that the world had no patience for people who clung to rotten boards. She used phrases like asset recovery and market opportunity. She stood in Daniel's workshop doorway with her arms folded and did not touch anything, as if dust itself might accuse her. The hotel company had been buying properties near the bay in a slow, deliberate line. Everyone knew it. Houses that had survived storms and recessions were suddenly wrapped in survey tape. Porches came down, lilacs were bulldozed. Ruth said the Callahan house would sell before the roof became a problem. She said Linnea deserved relief. She said Maeve, being nearly grown, needed to learn that comfort was not owed to her. Maeve worked that summer washing dishes at a seafood place where the floor stayed wet and the radio never rested. At night she came home smelling of fryer oil and lemon sanitizer, then sat at her father's stripped workbench with Silas's final words moving around her like moths. Do not let them call it junk. She had kept Daniel's favourite gouge, 3 palm chisels, a viner with a split handle, a brass caliper, a little egg beater drill, and a whetstone darkened by years of oil. She hid them in a canvas roll beneath a loose floorboard. In the fall, Ruth came more often. Papers appeared in envelopes. Linnea began sleeping poorly, the dining room table filled with forms, brochures, and a glossy rendering of a proposed waterfront hotel, all glass and balconies, as if the building had already decided the older houses were mistakes. Maeve would enter the room, and the papers would be turned face down. It was a childish gesture that made it worse. The sale closed on November 14th, 222. Maeve remembered the date because rain had fallen all day and the gutter over the front steps overflowed in a single clear rope. She came home from a double shift with her socks wet inside her shoes. Her aunt's sedan was at the curb. Inside 2 suitcases stood by the door, one grey and one blue, neither hers. A cardboard box sat on the hall runner. On top of it was Maeve's winter coat, folded with a tidiness that made her skin go cold. Ruth was in the parlour wearing pearl earrings and holding a manila folder against her ribs. Linnea sat in the chair beside the window, her hands flat on her knees, looking not at Maeve but at the rain moving down the glass. Your things are packed. You leave before morning. 8 words. No raised voice. No tremor. Maeve looked at the box. Inside were 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a library book, her toothbrush in a plastic bag, and the canvas tool roll still tied with the same bootless Daniel had used years before. Ruth had not found the loose floorboard, or perhaps she had found it and decided the tools were too worthless to sell. There is no room where I'm going, Ruth said, though Maeve had not asked. Your mother needs stability. You are old enough. Linnea's mouth moved once, as if a word had reached the edge of her lips and failed there. She did not stand. She did not touch the coat. Her wedding ring had been removed, leaving a pale groove around her finger. Maeve picked up the cardboard box. It was damp along the bottom where someone had set it too near the door. The library book slid sideways. The gouge in the canvas roll knocked softly against the drill. For a moment the sound was so familiar that she nearly turned toward the workshop to tell her father something had shifted. Ruth opened the front door. Rain blew in and darkened the threshold. Maeve stepped onto the porch, carrying the box against her chest. Behind her, Linnea made one sound, not quite a sob, not quite a breath. It was the sound a hinge makes after years without oil. The door closed. There was no scene after that, no plea in the yard, no last look through the window. Maeve walked because walking was available. She went first to the bus station and sat under a vending machine light until morning, her coat over her knees, the cardboard box pressed between her feet. The station smelled of burnt coffee and floor cleaner. At dawn, a driver with silver hair told her she could not sleep there another hour unless she bought a ticket. She bought the cheapest one north. For 6 weeks, her life became a line of public rooms and weather. In Salisbury, she slept 2 nights behind a laundromat where the dryers made the brick wall warm until midnight. She spent $6 on peanut butter, crackers, and a bottle of aspirin from a pharmacy with bright aisles and music too cheerful for the hour. She washed in a gas station sink, keeping one hip against the door because the lock did not catch. Her money went from the high 30s to $29 and some coins. In Cambridge, a woman at a church basement supper noticed the canvas roll and asked whether Maeve painted. Maeve said no. The woman gave her a folded napkin with 2 biscuits inside and did not ask anything else. Maeve slept that night under the overhang of a closed insurance office while rain tapped the metal awning above her. The biscuits had gone hard by morning. She ate them anyway. In Easton, she found a public library with green lamps and heat that came up through floor vents. She sat at a table near the local history shelves and read a book about wooden boat building because the photographs showed hands using tools her father would have recognized. A librarian with a silver chain for her glasses told her gently that she could stay until closing. Maeve nodded, kept her head lowered, and copied a diagram of a lap joint onto the back of a receipt. The nights got colder. She learned which convenience stores locked their bathrooms, which churches kept side doors open for choir practice, which grocery stores marked down bread after 7. In Denton, she slept in a bus shelter and woke with frost on the cardboard flattened under her shoulder. In Annapolis, she sold her extra shirt at a consignment shop for $3.50, then spent $1 on coffee so she could sit inside until her hands stopped shaking. She did not contact Ruth. She did not call Linnea. There were payphones still in a few places, Alex with scratched metal faces, but she never lifted a receiver. Words would have cost money and done no work. By Christmas week, she was back on the eastern shore because the land itself kept pulling at her. She stayed one night in a hay barn outside Berlin after a farmer's son found her walking along the road at dusk and pointed without making her explain. The barn smelled of dust, mice, and dried clover. Wind moved through the boards in thin, cold lines. Maeve slept between stacked bales with her tool roll under her head and woke before anyone could change their mind about the kindness. The canvas roll had become the one object that did not accuse her. Each evening, wherever she found shelter, she untied it and counted the tools by touch. Gouge, palm chisel, viner, caliper, drill, whetstone. She sharpened one edge at a time with careful circles, using a drop of water from a public fountain or rain collected in the lid of a jar. The act kept her exact. It kept her from becoming only hunger and cold. On the 38th day, with her money down to $12.70, she entered the Ocean City branch of the public library because the wind off the Atlantic had teeth in it. The library was not grand. It had low shelves, carpet-worn pale near the desk, and a bulletin board crowded with notices for tutoring, lost cats, piano lessons, grief groups, and rooms for rent that cost more per week than she had left in the world. She went there for warmth. That was the honest reason. At a table near the back, she removed her coat and set the canvas roll across her lap. Her hands were chapped. One knuckle had split and reopened so many times that the line had become dark. She read the local newspaper because newspapers could be held without anyone wondering why a girl sat too long in one place. Most of it passed before her without entering council minutes. Beach replenishment, restaurant closings, a photograph of children holding canned goods. Then, near the bottom of the classifieds, boxed between an estate sale and a notice for used crab pots, she saw a county disposal announcement printed in narrow type. Surplus structure and land parcel. Former amusement pavilion. North Ocean City Edge, Worcester County. As is. NO utilities guaranteed. UN safe empry. Buyer assumes all responsibility. Minimum bid, $10. Below it was an address she did not recognize, though she knew the shape of the coast around it. A line added in smaller print said the structure contained non-operational amusement equipment of no assessed value. Bids accepted in person at the county clerk's office before Friday noon. Maeve read the notice once, then twice. The room around her continued gently. A printer hummed. Someone turned a page. The librarian at the desk stamped a due date with a soft rubber sound. Outside, a gull cried over the parking lot, harsh and lonely. Non-operational amusement equipment. The words should have meant metal, rot, danger, liability, and a locked gate. They should have meant another place people had finished using and begun forgetting. But Maeve saw Silas's drawer of glass eyes. She saw her father turning a brass gear in the light. She saw the little maple horse she had carved at 14, bumping on its uneven cam while an old man watched and refused to flatter her. She copied the address onto the back of her receipt with the lap joint drawing. Her pencil point broke on the last digit. She sharpened it with Daniel's pocket knife, catching the curls in her palm so they would not fall on the carpet. The decision did not arrive like courage. It came as a narrowing of choices until one honest path remained. She could spend the last of her money staying cold in familiar towns, or she could put $10 on a forgotten building nobody wanted and see whether abandonment had told the whole truth. At closing time, the librarian touched the table lightly. "We are locking up now, dear." Maeve gathered her coat, the cardboard box, and the canvas roll. At the door, the librarian hesitated, then handed her a paper cup with tea gone lukewarm. No speech came with it, only the cup. Maeve carried it outside. The wind moved down the street, smelling of brine and diesel and winter sand. She stood beneath the library awning and counted what remained in her palm after setting aside the bid. There would be enough for one bus fare partway north if she chose the route carefully. There would be enough for a day-old roll, perhaps two. There would not be enough for regret. The next morning, she would walk into the county clerk's office with her coat brushed clean, her hair tied back, her father's tools at her side, and a $10 bill folded in fourths inside her glove. And by sunset, the deed to a condemned Carousel Pavilion would be the first thing in her life that no one had handed her out of pity. The first bus left before the stores had turned on their signs, and she boarded it with damp cuffs, a paper cup of library tea gone cold, and the tool roll hugged under one arm. The driver did not ask where she was headed until she had already dropped her fare into the steel box. His face was long and weathered, with a white moustache stained faintly by tobacco, and he wore fingerless gloves, though the heater groaned beneath his seat. When she told him Snow Hill, he looked at her once in the mirror, not suspiciously, only long enough to measure the thinness of her coat against the winter morning. "County business," he said. "Yes." He nodded as if that explained enough. The bus moved out through streets still blue with early light. Storefront windows held the dark shapes of beach chairs and faded postcards. A closed ice cream stand had plywood over its serving window, and the painted cone above it leaned sideways, its pink scoop bleached almost white by years of salt and sun. Christmas garlands still hung from a lamppost, though the holiday had gone. It had collected sand in its plastic needles. She sat halfway back. The canvas roll rested across her knees. and her cardboard box was braced between her shoes. Every turn made the tools shift gently against each other. The sound was not loud, but it kept her awake. Outside the bus window, Ocean City narrowed into winter emptiness. Motels stood with their curtains drawn, parking lots stretched wide and pale. The Atlantic flashed now and then between buildings, a hard strip of pewter under the morning. Farther inland, the land softened. Marsh opened on both sides, and the road lifted over channels where brown water moved without hurry through dead reeds. At Berlin, the bus paused long enough for a man in a paint-spattered jacket to climb aboard with a lunch pail. He smelled of drywall dust and clove gum. At Whaleyville, an older woman got off carrying a sack of prescriptions in one hand and a poinsettia in the other. The plant's red leaves trembled in the cold wind before the bus door folded shut. By the time she reached Snow Hill, the sky had cleared, but the air had not warmed. A bank clock near the square said 33 degrees. The wind came down the street in flat, careful strokes, lifting paper from the gutter and turning it over as if reading it. She had not slept properly. The night before, after the library closed, she had walked north along a service road until a weathered hay barn appeared beyond a split-rail fence. The barn sat back from the road, silver under the moon, with one door hanging crooked, and a row of black cedars behind it. She waited until no headlights moved for a long while, then slipped inside. There had been no animals, only stacked hay, an old rake, a broken feed bin, and the dry smell of dust held for decades. She made a place between two bales and set the cardboard box on one side of her body and the tools on the other. The temperature fell to 27 before dawn. She knew because the farmer's thermometer, nailed outside near the door, had a red line thin as a thread. By morning, her breath had silvered the inside of the box flaps with frost. Still, the barn had kept the wind off. That had been enough. Snow Hill did not hurry around her. It was a town of brick faces and settled trees, of narrow sidewalks, iron railings and shop windows that seemed to hold the same light from 50 years before. She passed a bakery with flower handprints on the inside of the glass. Beside it was a barber shop with a red and blue pole that turned slowly, though there were no customers in the chairs. Across the street stood a pharmacy with green awnings, a thrift store with a dress form in the window wearing a velvet hat, and a diner whose windows were fogged at the corners from breakfast steam. A hardware store sat near the end of the block, its front window crowded with snow shovels, kerosene cans, and a hand-lettered sign for storm windows. Maeve paused there without meaning to. A row of chisels hung inside in their plastic sleeves, cheap and bright and new. She looked at them only a moment, then she kept walking. The county offices occupied a brick building with white columns and a flag moving above the entrance. The steps had been salted, and the grains cracked faintly under her shoes. She stopped at the bottom and brushed her coat with both hands. Then she wiped the mud from the edges of her boots against the iron scraper by the door. Inside, the heat met her with the dry smell of paper, old radiators and floor polish. The lobby had a tile floor worn dull where many feet had crossed it. A bulletin board held notices about dog licenses, zoning hearings, tax deadlines, and a public meeting on drainage near the river. Someone had placed a bowl of wrapped peppermints on a side table. She did not take one. The clerk's office was down a hall under a brass sign. The door had frosted glass, and the word records had been painted on it in black letters that were chipped along the edges. When she pushed it open, a small bell fastened to the frame gave a careful ring. 3 desks stood inside, each with a lamp, a telephone, and stacks of folders tied with cotton tape. Metal file cabinets lined the back wall. A map of Worcester County hung beside a calendar from a local feed company. There was one woman behind the front counter, seated under a green banker's lamp, writing with a fountain pen in a ledger so large it looked like something that should have had its own chair. The woman looked up. She was in her late 60s, perhaps older, with iron-grey hair pinned in a coil so exact it might have been measured. She wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse and narrow reading glasses on a silver chain. Her hands were square and capable, the nails cut short and clear. On the counter in front of her sat a black name plate with white letters, Alma Whitlock, County Clerk. The nameplate had a small chip in one corner. Help you, Mrs. Whitlock said. It was not quite a question. Maeve stepped forward and set the classified notice on the counter, smoothing it once with her palm. The paper had softened at the folds. The pencil address on the back showed through faintly. I came about the surplus pavilion. Mrs. Whitlock did not reach for the paper immediately. She looked at Maeve's coat, the cardboard box at her feet, the tool roll under her arm, and then at the notice. You are here to inquire, she said. I'm here to bid. The pen stopped above the ledger. For several seconds, the room held only the tick of the wall clock and a faint hiss from the radiator. Somewhere behind a door, a man coughed once and turned a page. Mrs. Whitlock set the pen in its tray. That parcel is not a residence.
Yes.
Ma'am? It is not connected to water. Yes, ma'am. It is not connected to electricity. Yes, ma'am. The roof is compromised. Yes, ma'am. The county has posted it unsafe, and any entry after transfer is at the owner's sole responsibility. Yes, ma'am. The clerk's eyes narrowed slightly, not in dislike, but in the way a person narrows her eyes when trying to read weather far across a field. She pulled the notice toward herself and adjusted her glasses. You understand that the equipment inside has no appraised value. Yes, ma'am. You understand that removal, repair, taxes, injury, trespass, nuisance claims, storm damage, and demolition orders will belong to the purchaser. Yes, ma'am. You understand that buying something for almost nothing can sometimes cost more than buying something dear. Maeve held the edge of the counter. The wood had been rubbed smooth by generations of worried hands. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitlock leaned back. How old are you? Child? Maeve gave the number without lowering her eyes. The clerk breathed out through her nose. It was not a sigh. It was more deliberate than that. She opened a drawer, removed a folder, and laid it on the counter. The tab had been typed on an old machine. Former Carousel Pavilion, Parcel Un 17B. The folder had a brittle sound when she opened it. Minimum bid only, Mrs. Whitlock said. Nobody else has appeared. The hotel company sent a letter saying the structure was not worth hauling off. The demolition contractor said they would rather wait for the county order. There was one inquiry from a man who wanted the brass poles, but he did not file. She turned several pages. The county commission authorized direct sale if no competing bid was filed by noon. It is now 11:41. Maeve glanced at the clock. The minute hand moved with a small jerk. Mrs. Whitlock laid a form on the counter and placed a brass stamp beside it. The stamp was heavy, darkened at the handle by years of use. Beside it she set an ink pad, a carbon sheet, and a fountain pen. Then she opened a tin cash box and waited. The folded bill came out of Maeve's glove stiff from being carried there. She smoothed it once on the counter. One corner was torn and taped. Mrs. Whitlock took it between two fingers, held it to the light, and then laid it in the tray of the cash box as carefully as if it were a birth certificate. You will sign here, she said. Full legal name. Then here, acknowledging hazard. Initial here for no utilities. Here for no warranty. Here for county release. Maeve wrote slowly because her fingers were cold, and because each letter looked strange becoming part of a public record. The pen scratched. The carbon sheet made a ghost beneath her words. Mrs. Whitlock watched without speaking. When the last line was signed, the clerk turned the document toward herself, read every field, and then lifted the brass stamp. It came down with a sound that was both final and modest. Approved. A second stamp. Filed. A third. Harder than the others. Deed issued. The sound went through Maeve's chest as if some inner latch had been moved. Mrs. Whitlock folded the duplicate copy along exact lines and placed it in a manila envelope. She wrote the parcel number on the front by hand. Then she drew a rough map on a sheet of county stationery: Snow Hill to Berlin, Berlin toward the coast, the main road north, then a turn near an abandoned maintenance lane used once for the amusement park. She marked a gate, a service shed, and a pavilion circle at the end of a narrow access road. "You can take the bus back toward Ocean City," she said. "From there it is a walk." "Not a kind one." "I can walk." "I expect you can, Mrs." Whitlock tapped the paper. "Do not go by the dunes after dark. The sand road fools people when the tide is high. Stay to Coastal Highway until you reach the old park entrance. There is a chain across it. The key is in this envelope." She placed a small brass key beside the deed. It had a paper tag tied with string. The ink faded nearly grey. Maeve reached for it, then stopped. "Thank you, Mrs." Whitlock's hand remained on the envelope. She had been looking at the signature line. "Callahan," she said. Maeve went still. The clerk lifted her glasses by the chain and let them rest against her chest. There was a Callahan who carved for the seaside rides. Years ago. More than one, I think, though the one I remember came through this office after Hurricane Gloria. He was arguing about a permit for salvaged timber. Maeve did not answer. She could feel the tool roll against her side, the bootlace knot pressing through the canvas. "Mrs." Whitlock studied her face now with a different kind of attention. Not nosy, not soft. "Exact. He had your eyes around the edges," she said. "That sounds foolish, but it is true." Maeve's throat tightened, so she only nodded. "He brought a horse head with him once," the clerk continued. "Not the whole animal, just the head and neck wrapped in a quilt. Said the county inspector needed to understand that a pavilion was not the same as a pile of lumber. I thought he was difficult at the time. Later I came to admire difficult people who were difficult for the right reason." She slid the envelope across the counter. "The county will not help you," she said. "That is my formal statement." Maeve took the envelope. "Mrs." Whitlock leaned closer. "But the property has waited a long time for someone who knew what it was." The words settled between them. They did not ask to be answered. Before Maeve left, the clerk opened the lower drawer of her desk and removed a brown paper sack. Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper and an apple with a bruise at the stem. "My daughter packs more than I eat, Mrs." Whitlock said. Maeve looked at the sack, then at the woman. "It is not charity," the clerk said. "It is an error in lunch planning." "Yes, ma'am." She put the sack carefully in the top of the cardboard box where the apple would not bruise further. Then she gathered the deed, the map, and the key. At the door she turned back once. Mrs. Whitlock had already returned to her ledger, but her hand rested on the brass stamp a moment longer than necessary. The afternoon had sharpened by the time Maeve came out. Clouds moved low from the west, flat-bottomed and grey. She took the bus part way back because the route passed through Berlin before turning toward the coast, and she needed to save her strength for the miles that would not be carried for her. On the seat beside her, the envelope lay under her palm. It did not look important. It looked like something that might hold tax forms, or a school transcript, or a notice of some ordinary obligation. The key inside made one small bump in the paper. At Berlin, she got off before the driver had finished saying the stop name. There were still miles ahead, and light was already lowering. She ate 1 biscuit while walking. The other she left wrapped. The apple she saved. Hunger had taught her that sweetness should not be hurried. She followed the sidewalk past a row of houses with porch geese dressed in scarves, then out where the town loosened into yards, ditches and pine stands. Cars passed with their headlights on, each one pushed cold air against her back. The cardboard box grew heavier in her arms, so she stopped at the edge of a drainage culvert and repacked it. Library book at the bottom, coat folded tight, paper sack in the corner, tool roll tied to the top with a strip torn from the box flap. The walk eastward became a measure of small endurance. Farm fields lay winter brown under the sky. A horse in a blanket watched her from behind a white fence and did not move. A dog barked from the porch of a ranch house, then followed along its own property line until the fence stopped it. Near a stand of walnut trees, a man in a green pickup slowed, looked at the box, looked at her face, and drove on without lowering his window. By the time she reached the outer edge of Ocean City, her left heel had opened inside her shoe. She could feel the warm dampness of it with each step. The wind changed as the water came near. It was saltier there, more alive, and carried the faint smell of old pilings, gasoline, and cold sand. The route Mrs. Whitlock had drawn led her along Coastal Highway past winter-closed motels with empty pools covered in blue tarps, past a miniature golf course where a fiberglass pirate leaned forever over a fake lagoon, past a seafood restaurant with chairs stacked on tables and a chalkboard promising summer specials to nobody. Traffic moved in occasional bright bursts. Between them, the highway sounded deserted. She reached the former amusement park entrance near late afternoon. At first she almost missed it. The sign had been removed long ago, and only 2 square brick pillars marked where cars had once turned in. One pillar was cracked from top to bottom. The other wore a rusted metal plate with 4 empty bolt holes where a name had been. Behind them a chain sagged between posts, fastened by a weathered padlock. Beyond it a service road disappeared between bayberry, wax myrtle and volunteer pine. Maeve set down the box and took the brass key from the envelope. Her fingers were too stiff at first. The key scraped the lock, missed, found the slot, and turned with a dry complaint. When the chain dropped, it struck the post and made a sound that seemed too loud for the place. No one came. She looped the chain to one side and stepped through. The service road had once been paved. Now grass had risen through the cracks, and sand had drifted over whole sections, making the surface uneven underfoot. On the left, the remains of a ticket booth stood with its little window gone and its roof bowed inward. A faded decal of a smiling sun still clung to the glassless frame on the right. A line of game stalls sat shoulder to shoulder, their counters boarded, their painted prizes long removed. One sign, barely legible, still promised ring toss in red letters darkened by weather. Farther in the old park widened into a clearing. The Ferris wheel was gone, leaving only 4 concrete footings and a circle of weeds. A collapsed snack stand lay behind a fence, its menu board tilted under the words freezefunnel.ca, lemonade. The sea could not be seen from there, but it could be heard, a steady pressure beyond the dunes, breathing in the distance. The Carousel Pavilion stood at the far end. It was larger than she expected, and more graceful in its ruin. The building was round, about 60 feet across, with a low octagonal roof rising to a small cupola where broken louvers showed black against the sky. The lower walls were tongue-and-groove cypress, weathered silver and green with old salt. Above them, screened arches circled the structure, many torn open, some still holding strips of rusted mesh. The roof had once been painted deep red. Now it was mostly brown tin, lifted at the seams and patched in places with tar that had cracked like old skin. A narrow covered porch ran around half the building. Its posts were turned wood, swollen at the bases where rain had stood too long. Several leaned, but none had surrendered entirely. Near the entrance hung a sign so faded it seemed more memory than lettering. Pavilion Carousel. Children 25 to 20. Adults 40 Turk. Under the sign, someone had spray-painted a county warning in orange. The paint was newer than everything else, and because of that, it looked temporary, almost rude. The chimney surprised her. It rose from the back portion of the pavilion, brick, short and square, with a cracked cap and a small iron clean-out door near the base. She had not expected a chimney in a Carousel house. Then she saw the attached back room, built like a modest workshop against the round pavilion wall, with a separate tin flue collar and one small window facing the marsh. The place had not been empty in the simple way empty buildings are. It had been left mid-breath. She stood still until the cold reached through her coat. Then she climbed the porch steps. The third board bent under her weight, so she shifted to the side. The front doors were double, tall and secured by another padlock. The brass key fit this lock too, though it resisted longer. She had to hold the shackle down, turn, release, and turn again before the mechanism gave. The door opened inward only a foot before something blocked it. Maeve set her shoulder against the wood and pushed. There came a dry drag, then a crackle of debris moving over the floor. The opening widened. The first smell was salt, then mildew, then old grease, mouse droppings, rust, and something faintly sweet, like rotted carnival sugar soaked into boards. Dust moved in the beam of the open doorway. It did not fall so much as gather itself elsewhere. Inside the pavilion was dim, though. The broken screens let in strips of grey light. The carousel filled the centre of the room, its platform sunk slightly on one side. Its mirrors clouded, its painted rounding boards blistered and peeling. Poles rose in a circle, some brass, some steel exposed where plating had worn away. Horses stood in 2 rows, frozen at different heights, their mouths open, their eyes dulled by dust. Some were missing tails, one had lost an ear, another leaned sideways as if listening to the floor. Their saddles had once been red, blue, green, gold. Now every colour had been subdued by years of damp air, yet under the neglect the carving remained. Knees tucked, manes lifted, nostrils flared. Each animal held a little argument against being forgotten. Maeve did not step onto the platform at once. She walked the outer floor first, testing boards with the toe of her shoe. Near the east wall, rain had come through and softened the planks dark. She avoided them. In the southwest arc, broken glass lay beneath a shattered display case. Along the wall were ticket rolls swollen with moisture, a wooden stool, 3 rusted oil cans, and a broom with half its bristles chewed away. The sound inside was complicated. Wind entered through torn screens and made them rasp. Somewhere above, loose tin lifted and settled. A chain clicked at irregular intervals. Beneath it all was the sea, muted by distance, patient and without opinion. She crossed toward the lead horse. It stood at the front of the outer row, higher than the others, with one foreleg raised and the head turned slightly to the left, as if it had just noticed someone at the edge of the crowd. The paint was damaged but not destroyed. The mane had been carved in heavy waves, each lock undercut by a hand that knew shadow. The saddle was deep green beneath the grime, with gold scrollwork along the edge. Its glass eyes were dark brown, almost black, and though one had cracked across the centre, the gaze still held. Maeve stood before it for a long while. The eye has to know why. She did not say the words aloud. She only lifted her hand and touched the horse's neck where the paint had peeled back to reveal wood beneath. The surface was cold. Behind the carousel a doorway led into the attached room. The door itself hung open, swollen at the bottom. Maeve entered carefully. This back room was lower, rectangular, and more plainly built. It had a workbench along one wall, a cast-iron stove near the chimney, shelves above the bench, and a narrow counter under the window. The window glass was cracked but mostly present. Through it she could see marsh grass, a strip of winter water, and walnut trees bent away from the coast. The room smelled different from the pavilion. Less sugar, more dust, iron, and old wood. On the bench lay a rusted screwdriver, a bundle of brittle sandpaper, 2 broken paintbrushes, and a coffee can filled with screws gone orange. A stool stood tipped on its side. In one corner, a folded canvas tarp had hardened into the shape of whatever it covered. A calendar on the wall showed March 1987, with a photograph of Assateague ponies under a pale sky. Someone had circled the 17th in pencil. No note explained why. Maeve set her box near the stove and knelt to examine it. The cast iron was red with surface rust but not cracked. The flue pipe rose into the chimney, and the damper lever still moved when she pressed it, though it protested. Ash lay inside the firebox, old and powdery. There was no wood. No matches, no safe way to light anything before the chimney was examined. She knew that much. Light was thinning. She had less than an hour before the inside became unsafe to navigate. She moved with care, choosing one section of floor near the back room wall where the boards felt solid and dry. From the cardboard box she took the coat, the library book, the paper sack, and the canvas roll. She ate the second biscuit in 4 bites, then she ate the apple down to the seeds, taking time with each piece, because there was no reason to pretend hunger was not present. For bedding, she used the coat folded under her shoulders and the empty box flattened beneath her hips. The tool roll became a pillow. She kept the deed envelope inside her shirt, against her skin, not because anyone was likely to come, but because the paper still felt too new to trust out of reach. Before lying down, she returned once more to the pavilion. The last light had gathered on the horses' backs. Dust silvered their manes. The platform's mirrors, though clouded, held broken pieces of the room, a pole, an eye, a strip of roof, her own figure standing narrow and still. Rain began softly, first on the cupola, then across the tin roof, finding each open seam with patient fingers. She moved one loose bucket beneath a leak, then another. The third leak fell where there was no bucket, so she placed an old oil pan there and watched it catch the first drops with a hollow tapping sound. By dark, the pavilion had become a listening thing. She returned to the back room, closed the swollen door as far as it would go, and lay down on the floor beside the cold stove. The boards held the day's chill. Her heel ached. Her hands throbbed where the skin had split. Somewhere in the wall, a mouse made a precise, brief movement and then stopped. Through the cracked window, she could see one piece of the winter sky. No stars yet, only a clearing after rain. And beyond it, the sound of water moving in darkness. For the first time in many weeks, no one could tell her to leave before morning. The carousel had been waiting. So had she. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the pavilion gave back the night in separate sounds. Water dripped from the roof into the bucket, the oil pan, and a dented trash can she had moved under the worst leak before sleep. The 3 vessels answered one another at different intervals, not like music, but like a building trying to speak through damage. Beyond the cracked window, the marsh lay flat and pewter-coloured. Gulls circled low over a drainage cut, their wings flashing white when they turned. Maeve rose stiffly from the floor. The coat had kept her shoulders warm, but not her hips. One cheek bore the imprint of the canvas roll seam. Her hands were slow at first, and when she flexed her fingers, the skin at 2 knuckles opened again. She washed them with rainwater caught in the cleanest bucket, then wrapped one knuckle with a narrow strip torn from the hem of a shirt already past saving. The first 3 days were not dramatic. They were exact. She learned where the floor could be trusted, and where it wanted to answer too much. The pavilion boards spoke in different pitches. A high, dry complaint near the ticket wall meant loose nails. A deep, soft groan near the east curve meant rot below the plank. The back room had only one bad place, close to the window, where a boot heel made the wood dip like wet cardboard. She marked that section by setting a rusted paint can beside it. There was no well on the parcel, but near the service road she found a hand pump at the edge of a concrete pad. Half hidden by bayberry and bramble, its handle resisted until she worked it 20 times. At first it gave only a cough of air and brown water. Then came a thin, cold stream that smelled of iron. She let it run long enough to clear, filled a coffee can, and carried it back with both hands. She did not drink until she had boiled it in a small tin pot found under the bench, after scrubbing the pot with sand ash and patience. The outhouse stood beyond the workshop addition, almost swallowed by reeds. Its door had a crescent cutout and a wasp nest in one upper corner, long abandoned. The roof was tight enough. The floorboards were uncertain but usable if she placed her feet near the edges. Someone had nailed a Sears catalogue page to the wall in another decade. The paper had faded to the colour of weak tea. She spent the first day removing what could hurt her in the dark. Broken glass went into a bucket. Rusted nails were pried from loose boards and dropped into a coffee can with a lid. She found a squirrel skeleton behind the ticket counter, delicate as lace, and carried it outside on a piece of cardboard, placing it beneath the bayberry where the ground was soft. No speech was needed for that. By late afternoon, her back ached from bending, and the smell of dust had settled into her throat. She swept the back room in slow lines, raising little storms that moved through the light and then fell again. Under the workbench she found 2 warped boards, a coil of stiff rope, a hand broom with its handle split, and a box of ticket stubs printed in blue ink. Admit 1, ride safely. Thank you. The words seemed almost tender in their uselessness. On the second day she began to understand the weather of the building. The pavilion was warmer near the south arc when the sun came through torn screens. The workshop held cold longer, but lost wind faster once the swollen door was wedged with a piece of lath. The roof leak above the inner ring fell only after rain had soaked one seam fully, which meant she had several minutes to set a pan under it once a storm began. The cupola clicked when wind came from the east, but it did not shift enough to make the roofline tremble. On the third morning she found mouse droppings inside the cardboard box and moved her food higher, to a shelf where a metal parts drawer still had a tight lid. The remaining food was modest, half a sleeve of crackers, a heel of bread, and a paper twist of salt given to her months earlier with take-out soup. She rationed each with the care of a person handling medicine. That afternoon, after boiling water and cleaning the worst cut on her heel, she took the deed envelope, the key, and 2 coins from her pocket and walked back toward town. The hardware store she had passed before stood at the edge of Berlin's business district, in a brick building with a green-painted cornice and 2 plate-glass windows that had gone wavy with age. The sign above the door read Hollis & Sons Hardware, though there seemed to be no sons present. The brass door handle had been polished by many winters of hands. Inside, the air smelled of seed packets, pipe thread oil, sawdust, and floor wax. A bell rang overhead when she entered. The store was narrow but deep, with aisles that ran straight back into shadow. Bins of bolts stood beside drawers labelled by hand. There were coils of rope on wooden pegs, stove blacking in tins, mouse traps, lamp wicks, enamel basins, work gloves, canning jars, hinges, nails, putty knives, and a rack of paintbrushes hanging with their bristles downward. Near the counter, a potbelly stove radiated heat so steady that Maeve stopped beside it before she meant to. The man behind the counter was tall but stooped in the shoulders, with a bald crown, white hair at the sides, and ears that looked reddened by years of cold mornings. His eyebrows were thick and severe, but his eyes were not. He wore a brown apron with a pencil tucked behind one ear, and his left thumb was missing its tip above the nail. A tape measure hung from his belt. Looking for something, he said. It was the second time in 2 days that a person had made a question sound like a statement. Yes. He waited. She set her list on the counter. She had written it at dawn on the back of a county notice. Chimney brush, gloves if cheap, wire, nails, rags, lantern, matches, soap, stove polish, food if credit possible. The last item had been crossed out so hard it tore the paper. The man glanced at the list, then at her coat, then at the tool roll tied over her shoulder. You are the one who bought the Carousel place. Maeve did not ask how he knew. In towns like this, news often arrived ahead of the person. Yes. Name is Everett Hollis. He tapped the apron with one finger. My father opened this store when men still bought mule shoes here. I keep it because nobody has yet made a convincing argument for closing. Maeve nodded. That chimney has not been swept since Reagan, I expect. No. You tried the stove? No. Good. That means you still have eyebrows. He looked at the list again, and this time he read more slowly. You have money for this. She opened her palm. In it lay $2 and a few coins, none of them eager to become less. She had known before entering that it would not be enough. Yet the store had a smell of practical things, and practical things sometimes made room for arrangements. Mr. Hollis took the pencil from behind his ear. Do you have a deed? She removed the envelope from inside her coat and unfolded the county copy. He read it without touching the paper. His mouth moved once, not quite forming a word. "That clerk still uses carbon," he said. "Yes." She would. He tapped the counter twice with the pencil. "I do not extend credit to strangers." "I understand. I do extend credit to property owners." The distinction sat there between them, sturdy and unexpected. Maeve's fingers closed slowly around the edge of the counter. "I can pay," she said. "Not all at once." "I did not say all at once. I can work." "I did not ask for work yet." He turned and pulled a narrow ledger from beneath the counter. It had a red cover and a spine repaired with black tape. He opened it near the back, licked the pencil tip, and wrote Parcel and 17B in block letters, then looked up. Name, she gave it. He wrote carefully, not asking her to spell what he already seemed to know how to spell. "I will put a limit of $40 for now," he said. "Not because I am generous, because anything beyond that means you need a contractor, and you will not hire one with promises. You buy safety before comfort. Chimney first. Fire before paint. Food before varnish. Yes. Do not yes me into foolishness. No." One corner of his mouth changed shape, though he did not smile fully. He began moving through the store with the list in hand, taking items from shelves and bins with no wasted motion. A 6-inch round wire chimney brush, dented but sound, $3.95 because it had been ordered wrong for a customer years ago. 2 lengths of fiberglass rod from a mismatched set, $1.50 each. Work gloves with a tear near the cuff, 75 cents. A bundle of rags, 40 cents. Blue kitchen matches, 29 cents. Lye soap, 18 cents. A wire hand brush, 65 cents. A half-pound box of 8-penny common nails, 32 cents. 1 pound of 10-penny nails, 58 cents. A tin of stove blacking, 89 cents. A stub of candle in a paper sleeve, no charge, because half a candle is not inventory. A used kerosene lantern with cloudy glass, $2. 1 quart of kerosene from the pump behind the store, 22 cents. Maeve followed him, memorizing the prices, adding them in her head before he reached the counter. When he set down a small booklet with a green cover, she shook her head. "I cannot add that. You are not buying it." On the cover, in plain letters, was Practical Home Repairs for Farm and Shore, 1964 edition. The corners were bent. Someone had written E. Hollis in pencil inside the front cover, then later crossed it out and written Stork Kupi. Diagrams filled the pages. Chimney flues, sash weights, roof flashing, mortar joints, floor patches, stovepipe clearances. "You bring it back when you have read what you need," he said. "Do not use it as kindling unless you wish me to haunt you." "I won't." "Won't is better than yes." He rang the items on a register that clicked and chimed with heavy confidence. The total came to $15.13, entered in the ledger under her new account. She paid $1 cash, so the account did not begin entirely empty. Mr. Hollis wrote that down too. Before she left, she placed 2 dented cans of beans in the box. She opened her mouth. "Those are expired," he said. "By the manufacturer's imagination, not by God's." She closed her mouth and carried them. The road back to the pavilion seemed shorter with work waiting at the end of it. Her arms ached from the box, and the chimney rods knocked against her shoulder, but the weight was different from wandering. It had direction. She began the chimney the next morning before breakfast. The repair booklet instructed her to inspect from below first, then above if safe, to check for animal nests, fallen brick, creosote glaze, and blockage near the smoke shelf. She read the chapter 3 times beside the window while weak light rose over the marsh. The diagrams were blunt and useful. She copied one onto the back of a ticket roll wrapper, marking the firebox, damper, smoke chamber, flue, crown, and cap. The chimney's clean outdoor at the base had rusted nearly shut. She brushed its hinges with the wire brush, tapped the latch with the handle of a chisel, and worked it open a fraction at a time. Black powder spilled onto the floor. then flakes of creosote, glossy and brittle, like pieces of burned glass. The smell was sharp, tarry, and deep. It clung to the back of her tongue. She tied a rag over her nose and mouth. It helped only a little. From inside the stove, she removed the baffle plate and scraped the lower pipe with a screwdriver, catching soot in an enamel basin. The soot had layers, powder near the front, hard scale farther up. At one point, a nest of dried grass and feathers came down in a compact, filthy lump, followed by the hollow bones of some bird that had entered years ago and not found its way out. She carried the bones outside and set them near the squirrel remains beneath the bayberry. Then she climbed. The roof was not safe enough to walk freely, so she studied it from the porch roof, then from a ladder made of 2x4s nailed to the outside wall, likely for maintenance crews when the park still operated. 3 rungs were weak. She tested every one with her foot before trusting weight. The chimney rose from the workshop roof where the slope was shallowest. She moved on hands and knees, keeping her body low, one chimney rod tucked through her belt. The cap was cracked, and 2 bricks beneath it had spalled at the corners, but the flue opening remained visible. She fed the wire brush downward, rod by rod, turning clockwise, then lifting, then turning again. The resistance came in bands. First soft soot, then a hard ridge near the smoke chamber. She worked the brush through it for nearly 40 minutes, shoulders burning, breath damp inside the rag. Twice she climbed down to pull loosened creosote from below before returning to the roof. The whole job took 6 hours the first day and 3 more the next morning. She moved slowly because one careless push could crack a flue tile, and one missed pocket of glaze could turn a first fire into a chimney fire. She scraped until falling soot became a thin grey dust rather than black chunks. She checked the damper again. She held a candle stub near the flue and watched the smoke pull upward in a narrow, steady line. Only then did she gather fuel. The amusement park supplied what no store could. Not good firewood, but burnable fragments. A broken ticket counter shelf, several dry pieces of pine from beneath an awning, a split railing from the game stalls, and kindling made from cedar shingles found under the porch where they had stayed surprisingly dry. She did not burn painted wood. Her father's warning lived in her hands as much as memory. Paint could poison a room long after flame had made it beautiful. She laid the first fire small. Newspaper twist. Header sliver. Pine scrap. Then 2 pieces of clean, dry board no thicker than her wrist. The match flared sulphur yellow. For a second, the flame trembled as if considering whether this neglected stove deserved another chance. Then the cedar caught with a soft rush. Maeve crouched before the open door, watching. Smoke rose. It entered the flue. It did not return. She waited longer than hope required. 1 minute. 3. 10. The little fire strengthened and held. Heat spread through the iron by degrees, first near the firebox, then along the sides, then upward into the stove top where rust began to smell warm and mineral. The room changed. Not entirely. The walls remained stained. The floor remained dirty. The roof still leaked where weather found the seams. But warmth had entered and not been driven back. That mattered. For her first hot meal, she opened one of the dented cans of beans with a screwdriver and the edge of a spoon because she had not yet bought a proper opener. The lid came jagged. She poured the beans into the tin pot, added a little water and set it on the stove. Steam rose slowly. The smell filled the back room with something almost domestic, plain and brown and generous. She ate from the pot with the spoon, sitting on the floor with her back against the workbench. Each bite warmed her throat before it reached her stomach. Outside, wind calmed through the marsh grass. Inside, the stove clicked as the iron expanded. A series of small, satisfied notes. After that, the work became more deliberate. She inventoried the back room as if making a record for someone who might someday need to know how things had been found. On the first shelf above the bench, 3 glass jars of flat washers, 1 jar of cotter pins, 1 jar of brass screws, all dry because their lids had held. a tin of hardened white grease, a packet of sandpaper fused into one block by damp, 2 oil cans both empty, a folded pattern for a carved rosette water-stained at one corner. On the second shelf, a stack of maintenance logs swollen at the edges, years 1979 through 1986, a cigar box containing ticket tokens from another park, 4 light bulbs wrapped in newspaper dated August 12th, 1984, a coil of cloth-covered wire too brittle to trust, a tarnished brass bell missing its clapper. In the lower cabinet, 3 pulleys, 1 cracked, 2 lengths of chain, a wooden mallet with a taped handle, 4 chisels so rusted she could not yet judge them, a hand plane with its iron missing, a box of coloured glass jewels used in saddle trim, a bundle of paintbrushes standing in a coffee can, bristles hardened into fan shapes. Against the far wall beneath the stiff canvas tarp, she found sections of carved trim removed from the carousel's upper rounding boards. Some were beyond saving, the plywood layers separated like wet pastry. Others retained scrolls, stars and panels of scalloped trim painted deep blue beneath the grime. She stacked the usable pieces on dry boards and noted which ones matched gaps in the carousel canopy. The maintenance logs took longer. She opened them only after washing her hands. The paper smelled of mildew and machine oil. Each entry had been written in different hands over the years, replaced outside row pole bearing, tightened crank arm, horse 11 painted inner sweeps, lubricated center bearing, rewired light circuit, closed early due to storm, customer slipped near Westgate music roll jammed, outer horse lead mount checked. The phrase drew her eye. Outer horse lead mount checked. 3 pages later, lead horse belly panel loose, tightened with cedar disc and 2 brass screws. Maeve sat still, one hand on the page. It might have meant nothing. Repairs often meant nothing more than repairs. A belly panel could loosen from humidity, children's feet, vibration, or ordinary years of rising and falling. Yet the wording was not the same as the rest. Cedar disc. Not washer. Not plug. Not patch. Cedar disc. She closed the logbook and went into the pavilion. Daylight slanted through torn screens in long pale bands. Dust had settled again on the platform, though her footsteps from earlier remained visible near the edge. She climbed onto the carousel carefully, placing her weight near the poles where the structure had the best support. The platform dipped slightly but did not complain beyond a low creak. The lead horse waited in its raised posture. Up close, the damage was easier to read. The outer paint had checked with age, along the belly, below the saddle blanket, and slightly behind the foreleg. A circular area about 4 inches wide had a different texture under the grime. The paint there had been blended carefully, but not perfectly. Whoever had done it knew colour, but time had made their secrecy visible. She ran her fingertips over the circle. It was slightly warmer than the surrounding wood. Or perhaps cedar merely felt different beneath paint. She tapped with one knuckle. The sound was dull. She tapped 3 inches away. Higher, sharper, solid. She tapped again on the circle. Hollow, but not empty in the same way. She went back for the maintenance log, brought it under the horse, and compared the note with the body. Cedar disc. 2 brass screws. The screws were hidden beneath paint. She found the first by touch, a faint round rise along the lower left edge of the disc. The second lay opposite, nearly buried in a line of gold trim. She fetched Daniel's small screwdriver from the tool roll. The blade was too wide. She chose the narrow viner instead, not to pry but to scrape paint from the slot with surgical care. It took nearly an hour to free both screw heads. The brass had darkened green at the edges but remained intact. She pressed the screwdriver into the first slot and turned. Nothing moved. She stopped immediately. Forcing brass would ruin it. She went back to the workroom, warmed a rag near the stove, and held it against the screw head to loosen the paint and old varnish. Then she touched a drop of kerosene to the slot with a splinter of wood and waited. The first screw turned with a sound so small, she felt it more than heard it. The second resisted longer. When it moved, It gave way all at once, and she had to catch the screwdriver before it slipped and scored the paint. She placed both screws in the lid of a jar. Then she set both hands around the disc and tried to lift it. It did not come. She studied the edge. The cedar had swollen, paint had sealed the seam. She used the thinnest blade she owned, Daniel's pocket knife, and worked around the circle 1/16 of an inch at a time. Paint cracked. A fine line appeared. The smell changed, faint but clear, cedar, dry and sweet, protected from damp by its hiddenness. At last the disc shifted. Maeve stopped. The pavilion seemed to hold still with her. Wind had dropped. The sea was present, but distant. A loose chain near the canopy no longer clicked. She set the knife down, slipped 2 fingertips under the edge of the disc, and lifted. Behind it was darkness. Not a large space, but a chamber within the hollow body of the horse, made by the carve and join of the animal's form. Inside, just beyond reach, she saw the corner of something wrapped in oilcloth. She did not pull it out at once. She went back to the workroom and washed her hands. Then she brought the lantern, lit it, set it on the platform below the horse, and laid an old clean feed sack across the boards. Only then did she reach into the lead horse's belly. The first package was long and flat, wrapped in dark oilcloth tied with cotton cord. It had been fitted diagonally through the opening, and she had to turn it carefully to bring it out without tearing the wrapping. The second was smaller, cedar-sided, about the size of a Bible box with a lid sealed by wax at the corners. The third was a tin box, japanned black once, now rubbed grey along the edges. The fourth was a roll of papers inside a leather tube, capped at both ends with tarnished brass. She laid them all on the feed sack. For several minutes, she did nothing more. Her hands rested on her knees. The lead horse looked past her toward the broken doors, one raised hoof fixed forever above a painted wave. Dust moved in the lantern light. Somewhere outside, a gull cried. Then another answered from farther off. She chose the long package first. The oilcloth had stiffened but not cracked. The cord knots were tight, and she loosened them with the point of a chisel rather than cutting. Inside was another layer, this one of unbleached muslin, spotted but dry. She unfolded it and found tools. Not many. Enough. A pair of carving gouges with boxwood handles darkened by hand oil, a V-tool narrow as a bird's beak, a spoon gouge, a small adze head wrapped separately, its edge protected with folded leather, a draw knife with handles that had been replaced at different times, 3 rifflers, 2 handmade scrapers cut from saw steel, a brass divider, a wooden-handled awl, a mallet made from lignum vitae so dense it felt almost like stone. Each tool had been cleaned before burial. The steel showed only freckles of rust. The edges were dull with time but not ruined. On one gouge handle, initials had been burned so shallowly she had to tilt it toward the lantern. EC. She placed that gouge apart from the others. The second package, the cedar box, had a sliding lid that had been sealed at the edges with a strip of waxed linen. She softened the seal with her thumbnail and lifted it slowly. The scent rose at once, strong and clean, as if a tree had been waiting in the dark. Inside were raw materials and small treasures of the trade. Glass eyes wrapped in tissue, 12 pairs, each labelled in a careful hand. Outer robe, jumper grey, lead horse dark brown, spare amber. Thin sheets of gold leaf between paper. A packet of horsehair for brush repair. Strips of leather stamped with saddle patterns. A bundle of tracing paper tied with blue thread. Small blocks of basswood and maple. Sample cuts showing mane feather, nostril, hoof edge. A folded colour chart, hand-painted, naming pigments by mixture rather than brand. Prussian blue with lampblack, vermilion softened with umber, ochre cut with white lead, green undercoat for gold. She touched nothing with haste. The leather tube came next, the brass cap stuck, then released with a dry pop. Inside lay the original technical drawings of the carousel, rolled around a dowel and wrapped in tissue. The paper was heavy and cream-colored, brittle at the edges but whole. She unrolled only the first sheet and weighted the corners with screws. There it was, the entire machine rendered by hand. Elevation of pavilion, north face, platform diameter, center pole assembly, gear train, sweep arms, horse positions numbered, outer row lead figure, bearing housings, crank rods, galloper motion, band organ placement, service access. Notes in the margins described tooth counts, wood species, bolt sizes, and balance marks. The drafting was exact enough to guide a rebuild and beautiful enough to be mistaken for prayer. Maeve leaned closer. One corner bore a maker's mark, a compass, a gouge, and a small carved horse head arranged inside a circle. The tin box remained. It had no lock, only two hasps, stiffened by age. She opened them with care and lifted the lid. At first, she saw paper, then cloth, then money. The bills had been bundled in packets and wrapped in waxed paper, each marked with a year and a brief note. Repairs fund, winter receipts, organ motor, paint reserve, war bond redeemed, emergency. The top packet contained 20s, older series, edges smooth but dry. Beneath that were 50s. Beneath those hundreds folded in paper bands that had yellowed but held. Maeve did not understand the amount by looking. Money in a box is not yet a number. It is only pressure. She carried the tin box to the workbench because the surface there was steadier, lit the lantern brighter, and began counting the way her father had taught her to sort clock parts, one kind at a time, every stack squared, every uncertainty set aside. There were $100 bills in 4 packets, $50 bills in 2 20s, 10s, 5s and 1s, some silver certificates, a few bills so aged she hesitated to handle them until she slipped a piece of paper beneath each. In a smaller cloth pouch were coins, Morgan silver dollars, peace dollars, Walking Liberty halves, Mercury dimes, Buffalo nickels, wheat pennies dark as tobacco. There were also 3 modern quarters from the early 80s, bright compared with the rest, as if someone had added them last and without ceremony. She counted once, then again, then a third time because the number did not become more believable by being written. The cash came to $35,000 in bills. The coins at face value made 87 cents beyond the rolled silver dollars that had been marked separately as keepsakes, not spending money. Tucked under the last coin pouch was a military medal in a small cardboard case. Its ribbon faded but intact. The bronze star at its center had dulled at the points. A note beneath it read, "For Thomas Eli Callahan, returned to family, 1945. She did not touch the medal at first. The room had gone very still. Even the stove seemed to burn lower, holding its breath behind the iron door. Maeve looked at the stacks on the bench, the blueprints beneath their weights, the tools laid out on muslin, the cedar box of eyes and gold leaf, the medal in its case, and then toward the pavilion where the lead horse stood open, its hidden chamber emptied at last. There was one more thing in the tin box, a letter. It lay flat against the bottom, sealed in an envelope browned at the edges, addressed in dark ink to no name at all. My dear one, whoever you are. The handwriting was careful and slanted, and though Maeve had never seen it before, something about the steadiness of the loops made her sit down before opening it. She did not read it that night. The day had already given more than a person could receive without becoming careless. She placed the money back in the tin box, stack by stack, noting the order. She returned the coins to their cloth pouch. The medal stayed in its case, the letter she set on top, unopened. Then she closed the lid and placed the tin box inside the lower cabinet. Not because the cabinet was secure, but because it had a door, and sometimes a door helps the hand understand restraint. The tools she wrapped again, though not as tightly. The blueprints went back into the leather tube. The cedar box she closed after one last look at the labelled glass eyes. She returned none of it to the horse. The hiding had done its work. It did not need to do it twice. Outside, the evening had come on clear. She carried the lantern to the back door, then blew it out before stepping into the marsh light. Cold moved around her immediately. The sky above the water was the pale green-grey that sometimes comes after sunset near the coast, a colour too thin to hold for long. The service road lay in shadow. The game stalls were black rectangles. Beyond them the ocean moved where she could not see it, steady and patient beyond the dunes. Maeve walked to the edge of the marsh and stood with her hands tucked under her arms. Reeds leaned and lifted. A line of ducks crossed low over the water, their bodies dark, their wings making no sound from that distance. Farther out, a channel caught the last light and held it like a blade. She watched the water because water asked nothing. It did not require speech. It accepted reflection and broke it, accepted darkness and carried it, accepted cold without appearing injured by it. Behind her, inside the pavilion, the lead horse waited with an open place in its side, no longer quite the same creature it had been that morning. Nor was she. Yet the change did not feel like triumph. It felt like being handed a lantern in a very large room. She stayed outside until the cold made her fingers ache. Then she returned to the back room, shut the swollen door, and sat beside the stove with the unopened letter on the workbench across from her. She did not touch it again. The carousel had been waiting. So had she. As morning entered the workroom through the cracked window in a clean, slanted piece of light, and the envelope on the bench waited inside it. Maeve had slept badly, not because the floor was colder than before, but because the room now contained more than shelter. The lower cabinet held money, tools, drawings, and the medal in its little case. The workbench held the letter. Each object had its own silence, and the silences did not agree with one another. She lit the stove with yesterday's coals and a twist of dry paper. The fire caught quickly as if it had learned the room. While the pot of water warmed, she washed her hands with lye soap until the cracked knuckles stung. She dried them on a rag, then sat on the stool and brought the envelope closer. The handwriting seemed steadier in daylight. Not familiar, not known, but kin to something she had seen in the careful labels on Silas's wrapped glass eyes, in her father's pencil marks on scrap wood, in the exact way a person left evidence for hands not yet born. The letters leaned slightly forward. The ink had browned where time had thinned it, but the words remained clear. My dear one, whoever you are. She opened the envelope with Daniel's pocket knife, cutting only the narrowest edge so the flap and seal could remain. Inside were 6 folded sheets written on both sides in the same patient hand. The paper had been folded along exact creases, and when she opened it, it gave a sound like dry leaves turned carefully in a book. She read, My dear one, whoever you are, I do not know your name, though I have tried to imagine it. I have imagined a son of my brother, a granddaughter of my sister, a child of some cousin carried away by work or marriage or grief. I have imagined a stranger too, because buildings do not always choose blood, and tools do not always return to the hands we expect. If you have opened this, then the horse still stands, or enough of him remains to keep faith with the hollow place I made. I'm writing because Dr. Miriam Glass of Baltimore City told me on the 3rd day of March 1952 that what grows inside my left breast has gone farther than her knife can follow. She was kind and exact. I have always trusted exactness more than comfort. She did not speak of time as if it belonged to her. She only said I should put my affairs in order while my strength was still mine to direct. So I have done what I know how to do. I have sharpened the tools. I have wrapped what money could be spared. I have laid down the drawings, the colour notes, the horse eyes, and the patterns. I have written what must not be left to rumour. Our line, at least the part of it that can be traced through wood and work, begins with Eli Callahan, born 1821 near Kinsale, County Cork, Ireland, who came through Philadelphia in 1848 with a mallet, 2 gouges, and a wife named Brigid who could mend canvas so cleanly that seams disappeared under her hands. They worked first in shipyards, carving nameboards and repairing figureheads where salt had split them. Their son, Matthew Eli Callahan, born 1850 in Philadelphia, moved south after the war years and learnt ornamental turning in Baltimore, where the big shops needed hands steady enough to repeat beauty without making it cheap. Matthew's daughter was my grandmother, Honora Callahan Bell, born 1876 near Fells Point, Maryland. She had no patience for those who said women might paint a horse, but not carve one. Family says she carried blocks of basswood under her shawl so men would not ask why she was entering the shop door. In 1901, she came down to the shore with her father to repair storm-damaged amusement pieces for 3 seaside companies, and she did not leave. She married Asa Bell, who built gears and sweeps, and together they made the first full set of horses for this pavilion when it opened to summer crowds in 1903. Their daughter was me, Eleanor Ruth Bell Callahan, born in 1906 in a cottage behind the old park, with varnish drying in the next room and the band organ testing after the ball so loudly that my mother said I entered the world already tired of that tune. I married Joseph Callahan, whose people came from the same Irish root but another branch, and between us the name circled back on itself the way a carousel does, returning and not returning at once. For 4 generations our people carved, painted, pinned, balanced, gilded, mended, and listened. That last word matters. A carousel speaks before it breaks, bearings complain before they seize, sweeps sag before they split. A horse whose pole is binding will rise with a hitch in the shoulder. A gear tooth worn uneven will tap once each revolution, soft at first, then louder, until the whole mechanism begins to remember the fault. The trade did not close in a single day, though one day marked it. On September 21st, 1929, a gale came up the coast and tore half the roof from the south pavilion at low tide. The season was already poor, and after the banks began failing that autumn, men who once paid for repairs began asking whether paint might wait another year. It always waits until it cannot. By 1933, 2 shops had closed, 1 carousel had been broken for parts, and 3 master carvers had taken work making cabinets or coffins because those at least were still required. My father sold the big lathe in 1936. He cried afterward in the yard, though he would not have thanked me for writing that. We kept this pavilion going because it was ours in the way a burden can be ours. Joseph maintained the machinery. I carved replacement ears, tails, scrolls, saddle roses, and once an entire inner row jumper after a drunk man climbed it at closing and cracked the neck nearly through. My brother Thomas worked beside us when he was not away. My son Daniel learned to clean brushes before he could read the labels on paint jars. Then the world took them by turns. Joseph died in 1944, not from war but from the influenza that moved through winter houses and did not care who was needed. Thomas returned from the Second World War in 1945 with a medal and a silence so deep that it entered every room before he did. He lived 6 months. My son Daniel served in Korea and did not come home after November 29, 1950, near the Chosin Reservoir. A telegram can be folded, but it cannot be made smaller. After that, people thought I was done. Perhaps I thought so too. I closed the shop doors, but I did not sell the tools. I stopped answering letters from cousins who wanted to know whether anything was worth sending north. 30 years of silence can begin with one afternoon when there is no strength to explain, then another afternoon joins it, then a season. Then the young ones grow up not knowing the names that once belonged to their own hands. If you're reading this, I ask your forgiveness for that silence, though forgiveness is too large a thing to demand from someone I have never met. I will give what instruction I can. Keep the wood dry but not starved. If you carve basswood in winter, bring it inside 3 days before cutting, or the outside will warm faster than the heart, and your blade will lie to you. For maple, sharpen more often than pride allows. Use a mallet only when the grain has agreed. When restoring a painted horse, do not strip to bare wood unless rot or poison requires it. The old paint is a record. Clean first with mild soap 1 teaspoon to a quart of warm water, no hotter than a baby's bath. Test in the saddle shadow where mistakes can be forgiven. For hide glue, soak 1 part dry pearl glue in 2 parts cold water until it swells, then warm it in a double pot between 140 and 150 degrees. Never boil it. Boiled glue loses its memory. For gesso, use 1 part warm hide glue to enough whiting to make heavy cream, strain it through cloth, and lay thin coats, 12 hours apart, sanding with worn paper between the 4th and 5th. For gilding, red bowl under gold if you want warmth, yellow bowl if the light will be poor. Breathe away from the leaf. It is thinner than a promise. For the machinery, do not over-oil. Oil attracts what ruins it. Clean old grease from gear teeth with mineral spirits and rags, not wire unless rust has already won. Count the teeth before replacing any gear and mark the starting tooth with chalk. The center bearing must carry true before any horse is asked to rise. If the platform lists more than 1 inch across 10 feet, correct the support before touching the animals. Beauty placed on a crooked base becomes another kind of damage. I have left the original drawings because memory is not enough. I have left money because reverence without lumber is a cruel gift. Spend slowly. Make the roof answer first, then the fire, then the water, then the floor. A house or pavilion restored in the wrong order becomes only a painted wound. The medal belongs to Thomas. If you can, carry it once to a place where soldiers rest and say his name in your mouth. Nobody said it enough after he came home. There is a marker out back beyond the workroom door where the walnut tree leans toward the marsh. Joseph set a horseshoe in the trunk when our boy was small for luck. Though luck has always seemed to me a shy animal, the shoe will be grown into the bark by now if the tree still lives. Near that tree, my mother kept scraps for kindling, and my father cooled hot iron in a bucket after shaping brackets for the ride. Stand there when you need to remember that work is longer than sorrow. I do not know whether you came here from plenty or from need. I do not know whether your hands are trained or only willing. Willing is not a small thing. A careful beginner can do less harm than an impatient master. Inheritance is not the receiving of what is valuable. It is the consenting to become responsible for what others could not finish. Sometimes that is land, sometimes tools, sometimes a name that has been mishandled, sometimes a room no one has swept in 30 years. Do not be proud that you were chosen. Be steady because you are needed. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Eleanor Ruth Bell Callahan, April 18th, 1952. Maeve did not move when the last line ended. The stove gave a small tick. Outside wind passed along the marsh grass, making the reeds lean together and separate. A drop of water fell from some place in the roof she had not yet found. It struck the bottom of a pan with a sound so ordinary that her hand moved toward the letter, not to close it, but to keep it from being alone on the bench. She read the whole thing again. The second reading was slower. Names gathered weight. Years took their places. Kinsale, Philadelphia, Fells Point, the shore, the war years, the closed shops, the sold lathe, the telegram that could be folded but not made smaller. She stopped there for a long while, her eyes resting on the sentence without taking more from it than it had already given. When she finished, she folded the sheets along their original creases. She did not improve them. She did not press new lines into old paper. Each crease had been made by Eleanor's hand, and Maeve honoured that by letting the paper remember its first closing. She slid the pages back into the envelope and laid it beside the tin box. Then she stood. Her legs felt uncertain. Not weak, exactly, but as if the floor had become larger beneath them. She took the lantern, though daylight filled the room, and opened the back door. The air outside was cold enough to sharpen the inside of her nose. Marsh mud sucked softly at the edges of the path. Behind the workroom, the ground sloped down toward a narrow strip of brackish water. The walnut tree stood where the letter had said it might, not tall in the grand way of inland trees, but stubborn, bent westward by decades of wind. Its bark had ridged and folded around a rusted horseshoe set shoulder high in the trunk. The iron had nearly disappeared into the wood. Only the curve remained visible, dark and rough, with 2 nail heads buried almost flush. Bark had grown over the ends as flesh grows over an old wound. Maeve placed her palm against the trunk below it. The bark was cold, furrowed and damp from morning mist. She stood there without asking the tree to mean anything more than itself. At the base of the walnut, half covered by leaf mould and sand, lay scraps of rusted metal, a broken bracket, and a ring of darker soil where something had once burned, often enough to mark the ground. She crouched and brushed away leaves. Beneath them she found 2 small lengths of charred wood, old beyond scent, and a cracked horseshoe nail black with age. Work is longer than sorrow. She looked back at the pavilion from there. The building showed differently from the marsh side. The workshop edition seemed less like an afterthought and more like a shoulder leaned against the round body of the Carousel house. The roof patches were clearer from this angle, each one an old argument with rain. The chimney, flawed but standing, gave a thin line of smoke that moved sideways in the coastal wind. She returned inside only when her fingers had numbed. On the shelf above the workbench, behind the jars of washers, she had found earlier a short beeswax candle wrapped in yellow tissue and tied with cotton thread. She had assumed it belonged to some forgotten emergency box. Now, after opening the cedar container again, she found a matching label in Eleanor's hand. Shop candle, poured 1892 from Bayberry and beeswax, Christmas batch. It had survived 60 years before Eleanor hid the box, then more decades inside the lead horse, waiting through heat, storms, mildew, county notices, and the slow public belief that nothing of value remained. Maeve set the candle in the brass holder from the shelf. The wick had dried stiff and pale. She trimmed it with the pocket knife, then touched a kitchen match to it. The flame took low at first, blue near the base, then lifted into a small gold tongue. Bayberry scent rose faintly, not sweet like perfume, but clean and green and distant, as if summer leaves had been remembered by winter wax. The candle threw little light compared with the window. Its importance was not brightness. Its importance was continuity. She placed it on the workbench between the letter and the tools. For a while, she did only necessary things. She washed the tin pot. She added one careful piece of wood to the stove. She moved the blueprints farther from the candle. She counted nothing. She planned nothing. The mind can turn practical too soon when the heart has not finished receiving. By afternoon she sat on the floor with her back against the cabinet and let the names from the letter arrange themselves inside the room. Eli with his mallet from Ireland, Brigid mending seams until they disappeared, Matthew in the Baltimore shops, Honora entering through doors that had not been opened for her, Isa with the gears and sweeps, Eleanor carving ears, tails, roses, Joseph oiling what turned beneath, Thomas returned with his medal, Daniel lost in Korea, Silas somewhere in the far branch of the same tree, preserving enough to teach a girl whose family had gone narrow around her. None of them had saved her directly. That was the plain truth. They had done smaller things one after another without knowing where those acts would land. Someone had cleaned a gouge before wrapping it. Someone had labelled glass eyes. Someone had drawn a gear train with enough precision for a future hand. Someone had sealed a letter instead of burning it. Mrs. Whitlock had kept her voice formal and still slid lunch across a counter. Mr. Hollis had opened a ledger and called it property ownership. The woman in Cambridge had put biscuits in a napkin and spared Maeve the price of explaining hunger. Even the farmer's son near Berlin, pointing toward the hay barn without making himself large inside the kindness, had become part of the same chain. That is how rescue often arrives in a life, not as thunder, not as a door flung wide by someone who knows all the right words. It arrives as a paper cup of tea, gone lukewarm, a brown sack described as a lunch mistake, a dry place between hay bales, a library chair beside the heat vent, a clerk who remembers a surname with care. And maybe you have had one of those moments too. Maybe someone once left a porch light on for you, or paid for coffee without announcing it, or said one sentence you carried for years because you needed it more than they could have known. If a small kindness ever kept you moving through a cold season, write it below. Someone reading may need to be reminded that quiet mercy still travels. Maeve did not know the word mercy was in the room. She would not have used it. She only knew that the candle flame leaned whenever the wind found the crack near the window, and each time it straightened again. Toward evening, she opened the lower cabinet and removed the medal in its small cardboard case. She did not lift it from the lining. She read the name beneath it once, silently, shaping the syllables with her mouth but giving them no sound. Then she set the case beside the letter where candlelight touched the faded ribbon. The money remained in the tin box. She had no desire to count it again. The number had already been learned, and repeating it would make the wrong part of the discovery too large. Instead, she took one of Eleanor's gouges from the muslin and held it across both palms. The handle was smooth where another hand had worked for years, not polished for beauty, worn by use. The steel needed attention, and the edge would require time on the stone before it could safely cut. Maeve liked that. A tool sleeping for decades should not be asked to wake in haste. She rapped the gouge again. Night came blue, then black. The workroom held its heat better, now that she had found 2 more drafts and stuffed them with rolled cloth. The candle burned lower in the brass holder. When the flame reached the last inch, she pinched it out with damp fingers. Saving the remainder because waste had no place in the room, she made her bed as before, coat beneath her shoulders, flattened cardboard below her hips, tool roll near her head. But that night the arrangement changed. The envelope went inside the deed folder and lay under the folded coat. The heirloom tools, wrapped in muslin and oilcloth, rested along the wall within reach. The cedar box of eyes and pigments sat beneath the bench. The medal remained on the shelf above her, high and safe. Maeve lay down beside them all, not owning them yet in any simple way. Outside, the sea moved beyond the dunes. The walnut tree held the horseshoe in its grown-over grip. The carousel horses stood in darkness around their centre pole, their painted bodies damaged and waiting for hands that would not hurry them. For the first time since the door had closed behind her in the rain, Maeve slept without keeping one part of herself awake for leaving. The first snow came on December 6th, beginning as wet specks against the broken screens and ending as 4 inches of weight on every weak place above her head. Maeve woke before dawn to a different silence. Snow had a way of making even ruin seem deliberate. It softened the ticket booth, the game stalls, the cracked pillars, and the service road until the abandoned park looked less discarded than covered for safekeeping. On the roof of the pavilion, however, it did not comfort anything. It showed where trouble lived. By 7 o'clock, water was dripping through 5 places and seeping through a 6th, slower and more dangerous because it spread under the tin before appearing. The bucket near the inner ring filled first. The oil pan beneath the south seam took steady drops. In the back room, a line of moisture crept down the wall above the stovepipe, darkening the plaster in a shape like a long hand. Maeve stood on the platform with a pencil, a scrap of ticket paper, and the repair booklet held open under one elbow. Chapter 4, Roofing on Older Outbuildings, was not written for carousel pavilions. It spoke of barns, pump houses, sheds, and summer kitchens. Still, water obeyed the same laws over all of them. It entered where pitch failed, where flashing lifted, where fasteners rusted, where a seam had been trusted longer than it deserved. She read the chapter 3 times. The first reading was for fear. The second was for terms. The third was for work. The pavilion roof was octagonal above the round walls, each face sloping toward an outer gutter, long since ruined. The worst damage lay on the east and south faces, where old tin sheets had lifted. The workshop addition had a lower shed roof, patched with tar paper that had split under the freeze. She measured what she could from the porch roof, the ladder rungs, and a length of cord tied to a wrench for rough drop lines. The numbers were not perfect, but they were careful. For the workshop roof she needed 3 bundles of asphalt shingles, 15-pound roofing felt, 1 box of 1¼ inch roofing nails, 1 small roll of aluminum flashing, roofing cement, and 2 8-foot 2x6 boards to sister the worst rafter near the chimney. For the pavilion roof she could not replace everything, not yet. She would stabilize, fasten loose tin with neoprene washers, seal 2 lifted seams, patch around the cupola, and set temporary felt beneath the worst upper gap until spring could give safer footing. She wrote it all in the back of the ledger Mr. Hollis had begun for her, though he would never see those pages unless she chose to show him. Numbers made fear smaller. At Hollis and Sons, snow slid from the awning in soft thuds while she stood near the counter with her list. Everett Hollis read without interruption. His glasses sat low on his nose, and the pencil behind his ear left a faint grey mark in his white hair. "You doing the shed roof first," he said. "Yes." "Good. Sleep under the part you can make tight." He moved down the aisles, gathering materials with the same plain economy as before. 3 bundles of 3-tab shingles from last year's lot, marked down because the colour had been discontinued, a half roll of felt, a torn box of roofing nails weighed and priced by the pound, a bent but usable step flashing bundle, a short can of roofing cement with the lid sealed clean. He added 2 lengths of 2x6 from the yard behind the store, both straight enough for sistering, if not pretty enough for trim. When she asked about a roofing hatchet, she stopped, for the first time since she had known him. Mr. Hollis did not answer immediately. He looked toward the back of the store, where an office door stood half open. Then he disappeared through it and returned carrying a tool wrapped in a flour sack. "This belonged to my wife's uncle," he said, setting it on the counter. The hatchet had a square pole, a narrow blade, and a notched gauge for setting shingle exposure. Its handle was hickory, dark near the grip, with 1 burn mark along the side. "He roofed half the outbuildings between here and Pocomoke," Mr. Hollis said. "Died before I could give it back to anyone who would know which end mattered." Maeve did not reach for it. "I cannot buy that. I did not ask you to buy it. I might ruin it. Then do not." The tool lay between them with its old patience. She lifted it finally, feeling the balance settle into her wrist. "Bring it back when the roof no longer leaks on your stove," he said. Outside the store, an older man in a canvas coat was tying a tarp over the shingles in the back of a pickup. He had a narrow face brown from weather, white stubble, and a back bent not with weakness but with decades of lifting things above his shoulders. Mr. Hollis called him Mr. Pruitt. The man glanced at Maeve once, then at the roofing hatchet in her hand. "You climbing that pavilion?" he asked. "Only the lower roof for now." "Good. The high roof will kill you if it gets bored." His name was Samuel Pruitt, former roofer who had left the trade after one knee stopped trusting ladders. He would not take pay. He said this before Maeve could offer any, and said it with such finality that the offer died in her mouth. "I watch," he said. "You climb. I tell you when you're wrong." The work took 11 days, not all in a row. Weather interrupted. Wind interrupted. Once, sleet made the porch steps glassy, and Miss Pruitt stood with both hands in his pockets and refused to let her climb higher than the second rung. They began with the workshop roof because the stove, the workbench, and the sleeping floor depended on it. The damaged rafter near the chimney had split lengthwise but had not failed completely. Mr. Pruitt taught her to sister it with the new 2x6, bearing end to bearing end clamped tight, then fastened with 3-inch structural screws, staggered every 16 inches. He made her pre-drill because the older wood could crack if bullied. "Again," he said when her first pilot hole wandered. She did it again. They stripped the failed tar paper, pulled rusted nails, and scraped the deck clean. Where one board had softened, they cut back to sound wood and patched with a length salvaged from the game stall counter, planned to sit flush. Mr. Pruitt taught in small corrections, never speeches. "That nail's proud." Maeve looked. "Pull it." She pulled it. "Chalk line." She snapped it too lightly. "Harder." She snapped it again, and the blue line struck straight across the felt. He showed her the 3-stroke nail, place, drive, set. Not frantic tapping. Not one brutal blow that split the shingle. 3 deliberate motions, each with a purpose. He watched her first row, then made her pull half of it because the reveal had crept out of line by nearly a 1/4 inch. "Roof remembers the first mistake," he said. By the 5th day her shoulders felt filled with sand. By the 7th her palms had formed new sore places beneath the old ones. At night she rubbed them with a little cooking oil and slept with her hands open so the skin would not stiffen closed. Snow melted, froze, and melted again. The roof dried in patches. The stovepipe flashing took most of one afternoon because the metal had to be cut, bent, tucked, and sealed without trusting old tar to do new work. The pavilion roof received temporary mercy. Mr. Pruitt would not let her stand on the higher slope, so they worked from ladders, porch edges, and the cupola access inside. She replaced missing fasteners, pressed lifted seams down with padded clamps, brushed away loose rust, and sealed only what had to be sealed before winter worsened. Around the cupola, she slid roofing felt beneath a raised tin edge and secured it under a batten, Not beautiful, not final, but tight enough to keep snowmelt from entering freely. On December 17th, the workshop roof held through a hard rain. Maeve knew because she stayed awake past midnight listening. Water still found the pavilion in several places, but none fell near the stove. None ran down the workroom wall. The floor beside her remained dry. The next morning, Mr. Pruitt came by before sunrise, looked at the ceiling, then at the cold stovepipe, then at the roofline outside. He gave one nod. "It'll do," from him. It sounded like a blessing. January made the bricks honest. The first stretch of cold came hard after New Year's, with morning temperatures in the 20s and a wind that crossed the marsh as if nothing had ever stood in its way. The pavilion groaned at night. Ice formed in the buckets beneath the remaining roof leaks. The hand pump near the service road had to be worked slowly, with cloth wrapped around the handle so her skin would not stick. The chimney, which had seemed merely worn in December, began to show its deeper trouble under frost. 2 courses above the roofline had spalling bricks, their faces flaked away by years of salt, rain, heat, and freeze. The mortar joints were not joints anymore in several places, only powder held in the shape of mortar by habit. When Maeve brushed one horizontal bed with a gloved finger, it fell like grey flour. A vertical joint near the cracked cap opened enough to admit the edge of her pocket knife. She did not light the stove that morning. Instead, she wrapped herself in both shirts, the coat and the old scarf Mrs. Whitlock had later sent through Mr. Hollis with no explanation, then carried the repair booklet to the workbench. Chimney repair and masonry patching had diagrams of joints, trowels, flue clearances, caps, crowns and repointing depths. The booklet warned against sealing hard modern cement over soft old brick. Hard mortar could trap water and break the brick faster. A repair done for pride could ruin what weather had merely wounded. At Hollis and Sons. Mr. Hollis listened while she described the powdered joints, the cracked cap, and the spalled upper courses. "Do not use straight Portland," he said. "I read that." "Good. Reading has saved more chimneys than confidence." He set out a small bag of natural hydraulic lime, a paper sack of fine sand, and a coffee can of fire clay from an old stock shelf. The proper mixture for the outer repointing would be 1 part hydraulic lime to 2½ parts sharp sand, dampened slowly until it held on the trowel without slumping. For joints near heat, especially around the stovepipe thimble and firebox transition, he advised a leaner refractory patch. 1 part fire clay, 1 part sand, 1 part lime, only where heat required it, never smeared over brick that needed to breathe. "You rake back twice the width of the joint," he said. "Sound material only. No frosting over dust." "Yes." "Wet the brick first." "Not soaked." "Damp?" "Yes." "Small batches." "I know." "No." "You don't. You will think you know. Then the bucket will harden while you're still admiring yourself." She almost smiled. He saw it and looked away, which was his way of allowing it. The chimney work took 3 weeks because cold made every step slower. She could not work mortar below freezing, so she learned the day's temperature like a farmer. On mornings when the air stayed in the low 20s and the bricks held night ice, she worked inside instead, cleaning the stovepipe, brushing soot from the smoke shelf, and scraping loose rust from the clean outdoor. When the sun reached the chimney and the brick warmed enough to accept moisture, she climbed with tools tied in a bucket. Joint rake, pointing trowel, margin trowel, stiff brush, spray bottle, sponge and cloth. Her hands went numb every 15 minutes. She tried gloves at first, but the work required fingertips. She needed to feel when the joint was clean, when the mortar packed tight, when the trowel edge met resistance. So she worked barehanded for short intervals, then climbed down, wrapped both hands around a mug of hot water, and waited until feeling returned in bright, painful sparks. Raking out old mortar required restraint. The ruined joints came too easily, but the sound material below them resisted. She learned to stop at resistance. A person could damage a chimney by chasing perfection into strength. Dust brushed away, joints were misted. Mortar was packed in layers, not smeared across the face. She pressed it deep with the narrow tuck pointer, then struck it slightly recessed so rain would not sit proud on a shelf of repair. The spooled bricks could not all be replaced in January. 2 were too far gone and had to come out. Mr. Pruitt helped with those, standing below with his hands on the ladder while Maeve loosened the joints, removed the damaged brick and slid in salvaged brick Mr. Hollis had found behind his store, close in size and softer than modern stock. The replacements were not perfect matches. That was all right. Perfect matches sometimes lied about age. The cracked cap required a temporary crown. She cleaned the loose material, shaped a sloped patch with lime-rich mortar, and left a small overhang to shed water away from the brick face. It was not a mason's masterpiece. It was a winter promise. Inside, she repointed the stovepipe thimble where gaps had opened. She scraped loose material, vacuumed with an old hand bellows rigged in reverse because she had no proper vacuum, and packed the fire clay mix around the thimble in narrow lifts. She allowed each patch to firm before touching the next. The work smelled of wet stone, clay, and cold iron. By late January, the chimney looked less ruined but not new. That pleased her. Newness would have insulted the room. The test fire came on January 28th, when the afternoon temperature reached 34 and the mortar had cured long enough to bear a cautious draught. Maeve opened the damper fully, warmed the flue first with a twist of burning paper held near the throat, then built a fire no larger than her two hands together. Smoke rose clean. She watched the joints inside. No dark seep. No smell of smoke in the room beyond the first brief breath from kindling. Outside, she stood in the marsh grass and looked up. A thin grey ribbon lifted from the chimney and moved east. Unbroken, when she came back in, the stove had begun warming the tools on the bench. She set both hands near the iron, palms facing heat, and waited for feeling to return. The floors had been waiting under dirt, salt, grease, and 35 winters of neglect. Maeve began with the workshop because it held the work of staying alive. The boards there were white pine, 8 to 10 inches wide, hand-cut in uneven lengths fastened with rosehead nails whose dark square shoulders sat just below the surface where earlier feet had worn the grain down around them. Near the stove the pine had gone nearly black from ash and years of boot soles. Under the window damp had raised the fibres until they felt like fur. She did not sand first. Sanding dirt only drove it deeper. She swept, then scrubbed with warm water, mild soap, and a brush whose bristles had been cut shorter to make them stiffer. She worked in small squares, wiping each with clean water, then dry rags, opening the door whenever the day allowed air to pass through. Old grime came away reluctantly. In some places the water darkened at once. In others the boards gave up salt as a pale crust after drying, and she had to wash them again. The worst board near the window could not be saved whole. Its end had punked soft where moisture had entered year after year. She cut back to sound wood, squared the opening, and patched it with a salvaged pine plank from beneath the ticket counter, planned thin and trimmed to fit. The colour did not match. Mr. Pruitt said matching could come later, or never. Floors for standing, he said. Not posing. She rented the random orbit sander from Mr. Hollis for $14 a day, charged to the ledger with a warning written beside it. Dust bag must be emptied often. Do not let it catch fire. E.H. The machine was heavier than it looked. It hummed through her wrists and up into her elbows before using it. She set every raised nail with a nail set and hammer, tapping the rose heads down only enough that the sanding pad would not tear. She marked fragile boards with chalk. She hung damp sheets over the shelves to keep dust from coating the heirlooms. She wrapped the letter, the medal, and the blueprints and moved them into the lower cabinet. The first pass used 80 grit paper. It removed the grey upper skin and levelled the raised grain, but it also revealed scars, burn marks, heel dents, a crescent gouge near the bench, black circles where oil cans had sat too long. She left them. A floor stripped of every mark would become a stranger. The second pass used 120 grit, slower, following the boards with steadier pressure. The pine began to show itself then, not pale like new lumber, but deepened by time. The dark honey colour appeared first near the wall where light had not punished it. Then, after the third pass with 220 grit, the warmer tones rose through the whole room, running from dark honey into something close to mahogany where smoke and oil had entered deeply. Dust covered everything. It settled on her hair, eyelashes, coat sleeves, and the stove. At night, when she blew her nose, the cloth came away grey. She cleaned the sander with more care than she had used on her own shoes, then returned it to Mr. Hollis before closing, along with the dust bag emptied and brushed. For finish, she chose oil because varnish would have made a shell over boards that still needed to breathe. Mr. Hollis had raw linseed oil, but he warned it dried slowly in cold rooms. He also had a small tin of tung oil someone had ordered and never collected. They made a mixture for the first coat, 2 parts tung oil, 1 part boiled linseed oil, thinned lightly with mineral spirits so it could enter rather than sit. She worked with windows cracked despite the cold, rags laid flat outside afterward because oily cloth could heat itself toward fire if balled carelessly. Her father had taught her that before she was tall enough to reach a shelf, the first coat vanished into the pine almost at once. The second, 48 hours later, brought a low sheen. The third, after another full cure, made the grain look less polished than nourished. She rubbed the final coat by hand with clean cloth, following the boards until her shoulders ached. Under the stove light, the floor held a dark honey glow deepening near knots and old nail heads. It did not look new, it looked remembered. There was one bad morning in the middle of that work. It came after 2 nights of poor sleep, after the sander day, after her heel reopened, after she spilled half a pot of boiled water and stood watching it run between 2 boards she had just dried. No single thing was large enough to justify stopping. That made it worse. The room seemed to ask more than she had. The roof still had temporary patches. The pavilion floor still held rot. The carousel horses still watched her from their damaged circle. The money in the tin box did not swing hammers by itself. Inheritance, Eleanor had written, was responsibility. That morning the word felt like weight without handle. Maeve put the rag down. She walked out the back door and crossed to the marsh without coat buttons fastened. The air struck through the gaps, but she did not return for warmth. At the edge of the water, where winter grass bent over black mud, a great blue heron stood in the shallows. It did not move when she arrived. The bird was tall, narrow and patient, all angles and stillness. Its reflection trembled below it whenever wind crossed the water. For nearly an hour, Maeve sat on an overturned bucket and watched the heron watch the channel. Once it lifted 1 foot and placed it down again so slowly that the motion seemed borrowed from another kind of time. It did not apologize for waiting. It did not explain why stillness was work. She did nothing that day. No sanding. No oil. No sweeping. No plans. Near sunset, the heron opened its wings and rose over the marsh with 3 deliberate strokes, trailing its long legs behind like a dark thread. Maeve watched until it became part of the grey line of trees. Then she went inside, warmed beans on the stove, and slept. The next morning, she finished the second coat. February entered through the windows before it entered any calendar. The pavilion had too many openings to address at once, but the workroom had 8 windows if one counted the narrow transom above the back door. 3 had no glass at all, only frames where cardboard and scraps of plastic had been tacked by some earlier caretaker. 4 were cracked, each in its own pattern, 1 long diagonal split, 1 spidered corner, 1 clean break held together by old tape, and 1 pane with a missing lower triangle where wind came through like a blade. The last window, the west-facing one above the far end of the bench, still held its original wavy glass. The date scratched into the lower rail was 1903, not 1788, though someone had written that older number on the back of a frame in grease pencil, likely a part mark or salvage notation from another building. Maeve had learned enough not to trust every number until it had earned belief. What mattered was the glass itself, drawn unevenly, faintly rippled, turning the walnut tree outside into something that moved even when still. She would not replace that pane. The others she measured twice and wrote down in a column, leaving an 1/8 inch for seasonal movement. Mr. Hollis cut replacement glass at the back counter, scoring each sheet with an old cutter that made a crisp sound, then snapping it over the table edge with no drama. He wrapped the panes in newspaper and slid them into a wooden carrier that he said had once belonged to a glazier who could replace a church window in winter without removing his pipe from his mouth. For putty, she sold her a small tub of DAP 33 glazing compound. "Warm it in your hands," he said. "Not by the stove. Hands." She bought new glazing points, a stiff putty knife, and one coil of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord for the 2 windows with counterweights. The old cords had rotted inside the pockets. One sash had been painted shut so thoroughly that opening it required scoring the seam with a knife and tapping the rail with a block of wood for nearly 20 minutes. Window work had a different patience from roof or chimney. It was closer to carving. Too much force cracked glass, too little left gaps. Old putty had to be softened, scraped and persuaded from rabbits without gouging the wood. She worked one sash at a time on the bench, laying it across folded cloth. She removed brittle points with needle-nose pliers, cleaned the grooves, brushed away dust, and painted bare wood with a thin coat of oil primer so the new putty would not dry too quickly against thirsty grain. The putty began stiff in the cold. She rolled it between her palms until it warmed, then pressed a thin bed into the rabbit before setting the glass. The pane had to float, not rattle, not bind. Glazing points went in flat against the glass, pressed with the putty knife edge until they bit the wood. Then came the face putty, rolled into a rope, pressed along the edge, and drawn smooth in one angled pass. Her first line was lumpy. She scraped it out and tried again. By the 3rd window, her hand understood the angle. By the 5th, the putty knife made a clean bevel from wood to glass, sloping just enough to shed water while staying below the sightline from inside. She learned to wipe the knife often. She learned not to fuss with a line after it had settled. A nervous hand could ruin good work by asking it to become perfect. The sash cords gave her more trouble. She opened the weight pockets with a screwdriver and found the iron counterweights resting in dust, each tied to a ragged end of cord that crumbled when touched. The repair booklet showed the path, cord over pulley, down inside the jamb through the weight eye, secured with a figure-8 knot, then drawn back until the weight hung free. Her first knot was too large and scraped the pocket. She untied it, trimmed the frayed end and tied it again. The second passed clean. She liked the figure-8 knot. It had logic. It did not pretend to be fancy. It held because its path understood strain. When the first repaired sash slid up and stayed, Maeve stood with one hand still on the rail, surprised by the modest pleasure of it. Not joy in the bright sense. Something quieter. A mechanism had been respected, and in return it had resumed its small duty. Weather delayed the final window. A coastal storm brought sleet against the north side and pushed damp through every unsealed place in the pavilion. For 2 days she worked inside, sharpening Eleanor's gouges on the whetstone, flattening the backs, raising and removing burrs until each edge caught light in a clean line. She did not carve yet. She only prepared. On the 3rd morning the storm had passed, and the air outside shone with that hard February brightness that makes every broken thing more visible. The final window was the one above the bench, the one with old wavy glass and a sash cord that had failed on the left side. She did not remove the pane. She worked around it, softening cracked putty with a cloth warmed between her palms, lifting out loose sections and replacing only what had failed. The glass trembled slightly when the wind pressed against it, and she steadied it with her free hand. Outside, the walnut tree stood bare. Its branches were dark and jointed against the pale sky. The horseshoe had almost disappeared into the trunk from this angle, only one iron curve showing through the bark, as Maeve set the last glazing line. A chickadee landed on the branch nearest the window. It was so small that the twig barely dipped. Black cap, white cheek, grey back, quick eye. The bird turned its head once toward the glass. Picture this once toward the marsh, then began working at something hidden in the bark. Maeve held the putty knife still. The room seemed to understand the need not to move. The chickadee hopped closer along the branch. For a moment, it was framed by the repaired window, the old glass bending its outline just enough to make it appear both present and remembered. Then it flicked away into the walnut's higher limbs. Maeve finished the bevel in one slow pass. She stepped back. 8 windows. None perfect. All answering better than before. 3 held new panes. 4 bore careful repairs. 1 kept its original glass, its age visible and unashamed. Through that last pane, light entered the workroom differently now. It came softened by the old wavering surface, crossing the bench, the wrapped tools, the repaired floor, and the cold stove waiting for evening. Maeve cleaned the putty knife, closed the sash, and left the window to cure in peace. By late February, the walls began asking for attention. For weeks, Maeve had let them remain as they were because the roof, chimney, floors and windows had spoken louder. A wall with stains could wait, a roof could not. A crack in plaster might be ugly and still harmless, while a cracked flue could bring smoke down into a sleeping room. But after the windows held, after the stove pulled clean, after the workroom floor no longer lifted splinters into her socks, the failed places in the plaster became impossible not to see. The original plaster had been laid over hand-split oak lath. She knew it by the uneven strips visible where 3 patches had failed near the chimney wall. The lath was not sawn smooth. Each strip carried the small irregular ridges of a froe, split along the grain by hands that had understood wood before machines made it obedient. Between those strips, old plaster had squeezed through and hardened into keys. Many keys remained strong, some had broken. Where they had broken, the wall bowed outward in a shallow belly, hollow when tapped. Horsehair ran through the old plaster in fine dark threads. She stood close with the lantern and touched one exposed edge. The hair still bound the lime and sand, giving it a woven strength no smooth modern compound could imitate. The patches that had failed were near the chimney because heat, moisture, and old roof leaks had worked together there year after year. One patch above the stovepipe had cracked loose entirely. A second beside the back window had powdered at the edges. The third, lower and wider, had detached from the lath but had not yet fallen. When she pressed it with 2 fingers, it moved as one tired sheet. Mr. Hollis had a bag in his back storeroom that he brought out only after hearing the problem. "My father kept this," he said. The bag was burlap, tied with twine, the label nearly gone. Inside was clean horsehair, dark brown and grey, cut to plastering length sometime in the 1950s and forgotten on a high shelf. "Not much call for it now," he said. Maeve took only what she needed, though he tried to send the whole bag. She bought more lime, fine sand, and a shallow plastering trowel with a corner worn smooth from some earlier hand. The mixture had to be kind to what was already there. Lime mortar with sand and enough hair to bridge and hold, not so rich that it shrank, not so wet that it slumped from the lath. She removed the failed plaster with care. The loose sheet near the chimney came away in 3 pieces. Behind it, the oak lath had darkened but not rotted. She brushed it clean, vacuumed dust with the hand bellows contraption, then misted the lath lightly so it would not steal water too fast from the new mix. The first coat was the scratch coat. She pressed the hair lime plaster through the lath gaps until it mushroomed behind, forming new keys. Then she scored the surface with horizontal lines so the next coat would have tooth. It looked rough and unfinished, which was its purpose. She left it alone. The brown coat came after the scratch had firmed, 3/8 of an inch, no more. She built it gradually, bringing the patch nearly to the level of the old wall, then feathering the edges without smearing new plaster over sound original material. The repair booklet advised 72 hours before finish in cool weather, longer if damp. She gave it the full time. Patience had become one of the building materials. The finish coat was thin, only 1/8 of an inch, lime-rich and smooth but not polished. She used the worn corner of the trowel to match the slight unevenness of the surrounding wall. A perfect flat patch would have drawn the eye forever. This one settled into the wall like an apology properly made. When the last patch began to pale as it cured, Maeve stood before it with her hands coated white at the knuckles. "These patches will hold another 100 years." She said it softly, not as a boast, but as a promise made to the room. Doris came first by way of paper bags. Maeve found the first one on the workroom step on a Tuesday morning, folded twice at the top and weighted with a smooth stone. Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a jar of soup still warm enough to fog the glass, 3 tea bags and a heel of pound cake wrapped in a napkin printed with blue flowers. No note, no name, only the food left where rain could not reach. She carried it inside and stood beside the stove, looking at the bag as if it might explain itself. It did not. The soup smelled of chicken, celery, black pepper, and bay leaf. She ate half for breakfast and saved half for evening, because sudden plenty could still be treated carefully. 2 days later, another bag arrived. This one held cornbread, 2 apples, a wedge of cheddar, and a folded paper menu from the diner in Snow Hill. On the back, written in pencil, were 3 words: Doris, no argument. That afternoon, Maeve walked into the diner whose fogged window she had passed on the first day of the deed. The sign over the door read Doris's Lunch, though the building had likely held other names before it. Inside were 12 stools at a counter, 6 booths, a pie case, a coffee urn, and the warm smell of onions, butter, and old conversations. Doris herself stood at the grill, broad-shouldered and compact, with cropped silver hair, brown eyes, and a pencil behind her ear like Mr. Hollis, though hers was used for orders rather than lumber. She wore a white apron with a scorch mark near the pocket, and moved with the settled authority of someone who could run the room without raising her voice. Maeve waited near the register until Doris turned. "I cannot keep taking food," Maeve said. Doris wiped her hands on a towel. "Then stop looking hungry." Maeve held out 2 coins. "I can pay something." "No, I have to." "You do not." The diner went on around them. A man at the counter stirred sugar into coffee. 2 women in a booth discussed a cousin's surgery. The bell over the door rang and let in cold air. Doris looked at the coins in Maeve's palm and then at Maeve's face. "When the shop reopens," she said, "you can pay me in candles." "I do not have a shop." Doris turned back to the grill. "Not yet." That was the end of the conversation. From then on, bags appeared now and then, never every day, never enough to feel like ownership. Soup, bread, a boiled egg, once a slice of coconut pie in a waxed carton with the corner taped shut. Maeve learned not to argue each time. Gratitude could be practiced by not making kindness defend itself. Caleb arrived with an axe over one shoulder and a Schwinn bicycle left leaning against the old ticket booth. He was 16 or 17, thin as split kindling, with sandy hair falling into his eyes and a red knit cap pulled low over both ears. His coat sleeves were too short, his boots were too large. He stood in the pavilion entrance one Saturday morning while Maeve was scraping old putty from a screen frame, and he looked not at her but at the woodpile beside the workroom door. "You need that split smaller," he said. She set the scraper down. "I can do it." "Probably." He waited. "Did Mr. Hollis send you?" "No." "Mrs. Whitlock?" "No." "Doris." He shifted the splitting maul from one shoulder to the other. "My mother said." That seemed to be the full explanation. Maeve walked him to the woodpile, which was made mostly of clean salvage, broken railings, unpainted framing, pallet boards from behind Hollis and Sons, and driftwood pieces too salt-soaked to burn safely unless kept for outdoor use. She pointed to the dry pine and cedar only. Caleb nodded once, took off his coat, and began. He did not swing wildly. He set each piece on the chopping block, studied the grain, raised the maul, and let weight finish what muscle began. The first hour passed with little talk. Wood cracked, chips fell on snow, the marsh wind reddened his face. When Maeve brought him tea in the cleanest mug, He held it between both hands and drank without sitting. "I cannot pay much," she said. "Do not need it. I do not like taking work unpaid." He looked toward the lead horse visible through the pavilion door, then back to the chopping block. "My mother said. About your grandfather." She waited, because the sentence had more behind it if he chose to bring it. Caleb nudged a split piece aside with his boot. Her father talked about a Callahan who fixed the carousel after storms. Said when he was little that man let him sit on a horse after closing because his family could not pay for rides. Maeve held the empty mug. He remembered it till he died, Caleb said. Then he went back to splitting. After that, Caleb came most Saturdays when weather allowed. He split wood, hauled scrap, carried glass panes, swept the platform, and once spent an afternoon sorting screws by size because he said it was better than algebra. He refused money with a firmness that had no pride in it. When Maeve insisted on giving him something, he accepted a sharpened pencil, a biscuit from Doris's bag, and later, one lesson in how to hone a pocket knife without rounding the edge. Reverend Boyd was the quietest of the three. He walked past the park entrance every morning near 8. Though the church sat inland and there was no direct reason for his route, he was a tall black man in his 70s, with a dark overcoat, polished shoes, and a felt hat he touched whenever he passed the broken brick pillars. The first week, he only tipped the hat. The second, he paused long enough to look down the service road at the pavilion, then continued. On the third week, Maeve was carrying a bucket of ash toward the marsh when he stopped beside the chain gate. "Morning," he said. "Morning." His face was lined deeply around the mouth, not from smiling or frowning only, but from a life that had required both. His eyes moved over the repaired workshop roof, the smoke rising from the chimney, the patched windows stacked for glazing. "You staying careful?" he said. "I'm trying." Trying counts some. He tipped his hat and walked on. From then on, she gave the same small prayer each time he passed. 4 words spoken without performance. Keep her steady. Lord. Not loud, not demanding. Sometimes Maeve heard it from the roof. Sometimes from inside the workroom. Sometimes she did not hear the words, only saw the hat lift through the repaired west window as he passed the gate. He never entered unless invited, and he never pressed beyond what she gave. Once, when the wind had blown a sheet of roofing felt loose, she held the ladder while Caleb climbed to retrieve it. Another morning, she left a packet of stove matches on the gate post, wrapped in newspaper against damp. No note. He had no need of one. The pavilion began to contain these people without belonging to them. Doris in brown bags, Caleb in split wood, Reverend Boyd in 4 words passing the entrance, Mr. Hollis in ledger lines, Mrs. Whitlock in the deed envelope and the scarf, Mr. Pruitt in nail-heads seated flush and chalk lines snapped true. Maeve did not call it a community. The word felt too large and too easily painted on brochures. She only knew that the building no longer held one set of footprints. She postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door to it lay beneath a trap in the workroom floor, half hidden under the old canvas tarp and a section of shelving she had not dared move until the roof above stopped leaking. She had found the iron pull ring weeks earlier, rusted flat against the wood, but Eleanor's letter had taught order. Roof first, fire, water, floor, windows, only then the beneath. On the morning she opened it, the air outside was clear and hard. Caleb had split enough wood to last a week. The stove was banked low. The lantern chimney had been cleaned. Maeve moved the shelf, rolled back the tarp, brushed dirt from the trapdoor seam, and lifted. Cold air rose from below, damp and mineral, with the faint smell of stone that has known darkness longer than weather. 7 granite steps led down, each one narrow and worn slightly in the middle. The side walls were fieldstone, fitted without vanity, the mortar rough but mostly sound. At the bottom lay a cellar about 12 by 15 feet, larger than she had expected, with a fieldstone floor packed tight enough to be walked on without shifting. The ceiling beams were low. She had to bow her head. She stood on the last step and let the lantern light widen. There were shelves along one wall, empty except for 2 cracked crocks, a glass jar full of rusted lids, and a mouse nest made from old ticket paper. Along the opposite wall stood 3 wooden crates with their sides collapsed inward. In one corner, a coal bin still held a black dusting of fuel, though the coal itself was long gone. The foundation wall showed a white line from some flood year, but the current floor was dry. At the centre of the cellar, set into the fieldstone like a deliberate interruption, lay a single dressed granite slab. It was rectangular, 3 feet by 2, its surface smoother than the stones around it, its edges squared by a mason's hand. On its upper face was carved the same craft mark Maeve had seen on the carousel drawings, compass, gouge, and small horsehead arranged inside a circle. The cuts had softened with time but remained visible. She did not lift it. The decision came without debate. Some things announce that they are not for the first opening. The slab was heavy, yes, but not beyond all possibility. With a pry bar, with help, perhaps it could be moved. Yet Eleanor's letter had said nothing of it. The cellar had kept its own counsel for many years. Maeve let it keep it longer. She cleaned the room instead. She carried up the broken crates, swept the stone floor with the hand broom, and checked each beam with the handle of a hammer. Hollow sound in one corner. Solid elsewhere. The coal dust stained her cuffs. A spider travelled slowly along a mortar joint, and she stepped around it without thought. On her way back up, the lantern light caught something beneath the 3rd step. Not under it entirely. Wedged behind the riser, where stone met old wood, was a small oak box about the length of her hand. Dust had disguised it. The corner showed only because her boot had brushed away a clump of grit. She knelt on the step, set the lantern beside her, and worked the box loose with her fingers. It resisted at first, then slid free, leaving a clean rectangle in the dust. The lid had no lock, only a brass hook that turned with a little pressure. Inside lay a key and a photograph. The key was brass, darker than the county key, with a long narrow shaft and a bow shaped like the same heritage mark. Compass curve, gouge handle, horsehead. It was too finely made for a cupboard, too intentional for an ordinary door. Maeve held it in her palm and felt its weight settle there, asking nothing yet. The photograph beneath it was a tintype in a paper sleeve, the image dark until she angled it toward the lantern. A young woman stood in front of the very cottage-like workroom addition, though the round pavilion behind her looked newly painted and whole. She wore a long skirt and a high-collared blouse, sleeves rolled to the forearm. Her hair was pinned up, but several curls had escaped around her temples. In one hand she held a carving gouge, in the other, the reins of a nearly completed wooden horsehead mounted on a stand. Maeve's breath went shallow. The young woman had her face. Not exactly. Time does not repeat itself with a ruler, but the shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth, the slight leftward tilt of the head, the narrowness at the wrist, the watchful stillness before a camera. It was close enough that Maeve reached up and touched her own cheek before noticing the motion. On the back of the paper sleeve, written in brown ink, were the words, Honora Bell, daughter of Matthew Eli Callahan, age 25, summer of 1903. Maeve sat on the step for a long while with the cellar below and the workroom above, holding the photograph in both hands. The key did not explain itself. There was no note tucked beneath the photograph, no map, no arrow, no convenient confession. She searched the box again carefully, turning it over, checking for a false bottom because Silas had once taught her that old boxes often had more patience than their owners. Nothing. She carried the oak box upstairs and placed the tintype on the workbench beside Eleanor's letter. The resemblance did not diminish in daylight. If anything, it became less theatrical and more ordinary, which made it stronger. Honora was not a ghost. She was a woman standing in work clothes in front of a shop holding a tool. Maeve set the brass key on the mantel above the stove. It remained there through the rest of February, catching firelight in its cut edges, asking no question she could yet answer. When Caleb noticed it, he looked once and did not touch. When Mr. Hollis came by to inspect the sash cord repair, he squinted at it and said only, "That is not hardware store brass." "No," Maeve said. He waited for more. When none came, she nodded. The granite slab stayed in the cellar, swept clean and untouched. Some inheritances arrive folded. Some remain under stone. By March, the snow retreated from the edges first. It shrank away from the service road in dirty ridges, pulled back from the porch posts, thinned under the bayberry, and finally released the ground around the walnut tree. The creek beyond the marsh grew loud with snowmelt. Water that had been locked quiet under ice came down through the reeds in brown, shining channels, carrying bits of leaf, bark, and winter's loosened edges toward the bay. Walnut catkins appeared before Maeve was ready for them. One morning the branches were bare. Then the next they held small green tassels. Tentative but certain, the chickadees came more often. Red-winged blackbirds returned to the marsh and fastened their calls to the damp air. At the old ticket booth, weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete as if reading a signal from below. Inside the workroom no longer felt like a place borrowed from emergency. It was still plain, still patched, still incomplete in every direction that mattered. But the stove drew clean, the windows opened, the floor shone low under oil, and the walls had stopped shedding dust when the wind pressed hard. The roof over the workshop held. The pavilion roof still needed a full campaign, but it no longer rained freely onto the carousel whenever clouds gathered. The horses waited in their circle. Maeve cleaned them, but did not restore them. Not yet. She dusted manes, washed saddles with mild soap, loosened grime from carved flowers, and oiled no joint until she understood what the oil would touch. The blueprints remained on the bench some evenings, held flat by jars of screws, while she traced gear paths with one finger and counted teeth by lantern light. The mechanism beneath the platform would require jacks, cribbing, careful lifting, and help she did not yet know how to ask for. The craft itself waited too. She decided not to begin full restoration that spring. The decision was difficult only until she made it. Eleanor's tools were sharp now. The sample blocks lay ready. The glass eyes had been inspected and rewrapped. The gold leaf was safe. The blueprints were legible. Money rested in the tin box. All these things could encourage haste if a person mistook possession for readiness. She would order small amounts of proper material first. Basewood for practice cuts, hide glue pearls, whiting bowl, a few pigments safe enough for trial panels, and a better respirator before touching any old paint that might contain lead. She would spend 1 coin, perhaps 2, and record each use. She would practice on loose boards before laying a hand on the lead horse's face. In late April, she took 1 worn silver dollar from the cloth pouch and carried it to Mr. Hollis, not to spend as currency but to show him what she meant to use. He sent it back across the counter. "Keep that," he said. "Pay with the bills. Coins remember too much." So she used a $5 bill from the repair packet, wrote the amount in her ledger, and ordered only what the first practice required. At night, when spring rain moved lightly over the roof, she sat at the bench and carved leaves from scrap basswood. Some were poor, some were honest. She kept the honest ones and shaved the poor ones back into kindling. The lead horse watched from the dim pavilion, one cracked eye turned toward the workroom door. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, Maeve finished the first piece that was worthy of leaving the workbench. It was not a horse. She had refused that leap each time pride tried to dress itself as readiness. The first finished piece was a small carved panel made from basswood seasoned through 2 full years in the workroom rafters, a border of bay leaves surrounding a single rising gull. Its wings cut shallow so shadow rather than force gave them lift. In the lower corner she carved the heritage mark, not as a claim to mastery, but as a statement of custody. The panel measured 12 inches by 8. She had drawn the pattern 6 times before touching wood. She had carved it twice in pine and once in scrap maple, learning where the curve wanted to break and where the feather lines became too busy for the eye. The final panel took 9 evenings and 1 whole Sunday of rain. She sealed it with thin shellac, sanded lightly with worn paper, then laid 2 coats of milk paint mixed in a blue-grey that matched the winter ocean after sunset. When dry, she rubbed the high points back, so the wood showed through like light under cloud. Doris received it wrapped in brown paper. Maeve left it on the diner counter before opening, beside the coffee urn, and wrote only for Candle's Ode. Doris unwrapped it after the breakfast rush, stood with both hands on the paper, and said nothing for so long that the cook came out from the kitchen to see whether something had gone wrong. Nothing had. The panel hung thereafter near the pie case, slightly crooked because Doris said a perfect level made a room nervous. Customers asked about it. Doris gave them an index card from a stack near the register. Callahan Carousel Works. Repairs, carving, small commissions. Ask by mail or leave name here. There was no grand reopening. No newspaper photograph. No ribbon across the broken brick pillars. Maeve did not want strangers arriving to praise what they did not know how to respect. The shop reopened the way seedlings open a field, quietly, from below, without asking permission from the road. By that second winter, the workroom had become a place with its own settled order. The stove stood blacked and sound, its pipe clean, its hearth edged with salvaged brick. Above it, the mantel held the brass key, the tintype of Honora, the medal case, and a row of practice carvings, small enough to be lessons rather than decorations. The west window still bent the walnut tree into wavering shapes. The floor had darkened under use, taking new scuffs beside old ones. The plaster patches had cured pale and strong, not invisible but honest. The workbench had been flattened, oiled, and fitted with a vice Mr. Hollis found in the back of a shed belonging to someone's cousin. Eleanor's gouges lay in a rack Maeve carved from walnut windfall. Daniel's tools rested beside them. Silas's last gouge, the one placed in her pocket at the hospital, had the centre position, not because it was the finest, but because some objects carry doors inside them. The pavilion beyond remained partly wounded. The carousel platform had been levelled enough to prevent further strain, and temporary cribbing held the worst sag until proper bearings could be machined. Maeve had cleaned every horse, catalogued damage, numbered missing trim, wrapped loose fragments, and covered the lead horse's open panel with a reversible cedar patch held by brass screws. Its secret chamber was empty now, but not abandoned. She lined it with clean cloth and placed inside a copy of her first condition report, written by hand. The building no longer smelled of rot first. It smelled of wood, stove heat, paste wax, paper, coffee, and sometimes bayberry when she burned the last of the old candle only on the coldest evenings, never more than a few minutes at a time. The brass key remained unexplained until the walnut gave up the answer in its own season. It happened after a January thaw when rain softened the bark around the grown-over horseshoe. Maeve was outside clearing fallen branches after a night of wind. The marsh was brown and high, the service road slick with mud. She carried an armload of limbs toward the chopping block when she noticed that one end of the old horseshoe had loosened slightly from the trunk, not free, but edged outward by the swelling and shrinking of decades. She set down the branches and stood close. The bark around the shoe had cracked along a line too straight to be natural. Not a fresh break. More like an old seam reopened by weather. She touched it with her fingertips and felt metal beneath the bark. Not the rough iron of the horseshoe, but something smoother. She did not pry that day. Instead, she cleaned around the area with a soft brush, cutting away only loose bark already dead and lifting. Beneath it, set into the living wood long ago and half swallowed by growth, was a small brass plate no larger than her palm. Most of it had been hidden by the tree. At its centre was a narrow keyhole. Maeve went inside, took the brass key from the mantel, and returned without hurrying. The key entered with difficulty because bark had pressed around the plate and time had settled grit into the slot. She worked it gently, withdrew, cleaned, tried again. On the third attempt, it turned. A small panel in the trunk shifted outward. The compartment behind it was lined in tin and dry as a held breath. Inside lay a folded cloth wrapped in oilskin, and beneath it a note tied with blue thread. She carried both to the workroom before opening them, because the cold air felt too blunt for whatever had waited there. The cloth was a 48-star American flag, small, hand-stitched, folded not in ceremonial triangles but in a practical square. The fabric had yellowed at the folds, but the stars remained clear in their field. The note was dated July 15th, 1953, and written in a hand less steady than Eleanor's but related to it in discipline. To the one who finds the key. This flag belonged to Thomas when he came home from the war. It stood beside his chair the last summer he sat on the porch. He said very little by then, but once he asked me not to let the medal be kept alone. I could not bear to leave both in the same hiding place, because grief stored together sometimes becomes too heavy for the next hand, so I put the medal with the account, and the flag here in the walnut that Joseph trusted for luck. Thomas Eli Callahan served in the United States Army in the Second World War and came back in 1945, changed past my understanding. My son Daniel did not come back from Korea. If you're able, remember them without making them grander than they were. They were men. They laughed, argued, left muddy boots where they should not, and loved music badly played. The flag is not for display unless you know why you're displaying it. Keep it dry. Keep it folded. Say their names now and then. Eleanor Ruth Bell Callahan. Maeve read the note once, then sat down. The workroom was very still. The flag lay on the bench between the brass key and the medal case. Outside, the walnut tree stood with its small panel open, an old guardian that had held one more thing without boasting of it. That spring, on May 26th, 2025, Memorial Day, Maeve carried the medal and the folded flag to the Eastern Shore Veterans Cemetery near Hurlock, Maryland. She had checked the date twice and the weather 3 times. The morning was clear. Flags already lined the roads when she arrived. She did not know where Thomas rested. His body had come home once, but family records had scattered, and the cemetery office could not place him with certainty from the information she had. So she walked to a quiet section beneath young trees, stood where the grass was trimmed and the stones aligned, and held the medal case in both hands. Thomas Eli Callahan, she said. Only that. Then, after a while, Daniel Callahan. The name belonged to more than one man in her life now, and she let it. She did not leave the medal there. Eleanor had asked that it be carried, not surrendered. Maeve brought it home, dusted the case with a soft brush, and returned it to the mantel beside the folded flag, which she wrapped again in oilskin and placed in a cedar-lined drawer she had built beneath the bench. The money remained mostly untouched. That surprised people only if they learnt of it, and almost no one did. She spent slowly and recorded every use. Roofing materials, lime, glass, sash cord, kerosene, food when the ledger and dignity both allowed it. 3 coins left the pouch in those first years. 1 wheat penny she set into the underside of the workbench as a date mark for the repair. 1 mercury dime she gave Caleb after he carved his first clean feather line and tried to refuse the lesson's worth. 1 worn silver dollar she carried in her pocket during the cemetery visit, then returned to the tin because Mr. Hollis had been right. Coins remember too much. The larger bills stayed wrapped, divided as Eleanor had divided them, with new notes added in Maeve's hand. Roof stabilization, chimney, glass, practice stock, future-bearing work, emergency. She placed the tin box inside a hidden but accessible cabinet, not in the horse again, but behind a removable panel under the workbench. Beside it she left a ledger explaining each expense. Most of the money would remain sealed for the next one. Maeve did not know who that would be. A niece not yet born. A stranger with careful hands. A future caretaker who might arrive from comfort or need. It did not matter as much as she had once thought. Blood was one kind of road. Work was another. By the end of 2025, the mailing list on Doris's corkboard held 43 names. Some wanted small carved panels. Some wanted repaired chair crests, missing finials, a wooden toy mended, a porch bracket copied. a family cradle cleaned and stabilized. Maeve accepted fewer jobs than she was offered. She turned away anything that required haste. She turned away anyone who said, "It does not have to be perfect," but meant, "It does not have to be respected." The index card at Doris's lunch became stained near the thumbtack from being handled. Doris recopied it twice. The third card included hours. Callahan Carousel Works. Open by appointment. No walk-ins beyond the gate. Leave name with Doris. There were still no signs at the road for tourists. The broken brick pillars remained. The county warning paint faded under sun and salt. Those who needed the shop found it through the diner, the hardware store, Reverend Boyd's church bulletin, or a neighbour who had seen smoke from the chimney and said, with some satisfaction, that the place had not fallen down after all. Caleb returned one grey afternoon in early December with something wrapped in a bedsheet and tied awkwardly with rope. He was taller by then, though still narrow, with his hair cut shorter, and a new seriousness around the eyes that came from being nearly grown and not yet used to it. His Schwinn bicycle had been replaced by a pickup older than he was, its passenger door a different colour from the rest. He backed it through the gate with great caution, then refused Maeve's help unloading. "Close your eyes," he said. "No." "Then look at the marsh." She did. Behind her, she dragged the object from the truck bed, muttered once when it caught on the tailgate, and carried it to the pavilion entrance. The bedsheet came away with a soft pull. The sign was hand-carved from 2 joined cedar boards, the letters deep and uneven in a way that showed both effort and youth. Along the top ran a border of simple leaves. At one corner, a small horse head had been attempted, its jaw too square, its eye too large, but alive with attention. The words read, "Callahan and Daughters, Carousel Works." Maeve stood without speaking. Caleb looked at the sign, then at the floor. The plural is important. There are no daughters. He pushed his hands into his coat pockets. There might be. The wind moved through the pavilion screens, touching the horses in their circle. The lead horse faced the open door, dark eye cracked but steady. Beyond it, the workroom stove sent a thin warmth into the colder space. Maeve walked closer to the sign. The letters were too deep in places, and shallow in others. One S leaned. The ampersand had required courage beyond skill. She ran her fingers along the carved word "daughters" and found 3 places where the blade had torn against the grain. Caleb saw her noticing. "I can fix those," he said.
"No."
He looked up. "Leave them," she said. His face changed in a way he tried to hide. They mounted the sign inside the pavilion, not outside by the road. It hung above the workroom door, where anyone entering the shop would see it, and where the carousel horses could face it in their endless circle. Caleb used brass screws. Maeve held the level. Mr. Pruitt, who had come by only to return a borrowed clamp, stood with his arms crossed and said nothing until the last screw was set. Then he looked at Caleb. "Letters hold." Caleb nodded, as if receiving a formal certification. That winter, Maeve began writing her own letter. She did not begin because she felt finished. That would have been dishonest. The carousel was not restored. The pavilion roof still needed full replacement. The band organ remained silent, its bellows cracked, its rolls brittle. The gear train had been cleaned but not yet fully repaired. The lead horse's paint waited under conservation tissue and notes. Many things were incomplete, but Eleanor had not waited until completion to write. She had written because time could not be trusted to carry intention without help. Maeve chose paper from the county stationery Mrs. Whitlock had once used for the map, blank sheets given later with the clerk's dry remark that outdated letterhead should do some honest work. She sharpened a pencil first, then set it aside and filled a fountain pen Mr. Hollis had found in a drawer. The first words did not need invention. They had been waiting too. "My dear one, whoever you are." She stopped after writing the line. The stove burned low. Snow tapped lightly against the windows, not hard enough to threaten, just enough to be heard. On the mantel, the brass key rested beside Honora's tintype. The medal case lay below the folded flag in its cedar drawer. The tin box was sealed. The ledger was current. Caleb's sign watched from the pavilion doorway, its plural word holding more room than the present required. Maeve wrote slowly. She wrote where the roof still needed work. She wrote which shingles had been temporary. She wrote the mortar ratios that had held through 2 winters. She wrote the warning about the 3rd floorboard from the east wall, which looked sound but should be lifted before any heavier machine entered. She wrote the location of the tin box, the reason for the ledger, and the names of those whose kindness had entered the building as surely as nails. She wrote Doris, Everett Hollis, Alma Whitlock, Samuel Pruitt, Caleb, Reverend Boyd. She wrote of Daniel and Silas with no attempt to make their lives cleaner than they were. She wrote of Linnea only once, in a sentence that did not accuse and did not excuse. Some doors close because fear has learned the shape of a hand. She left it there. Ruth's name did not enter the letter. There was no need. Not every wound deserved preservation. She wrote of the lead horse and how its belly had held more than money. She wrote that the money must never become a reason to spend quickly. She wrote that a hidden fund could save a roof, but only steady hands could save a craft. She wrote that tools are not heirlooms until someone uses them with care. Near the end, she added one sentence and then sat looking at it for a long time. The carousel had been waiting. So had she. It was true, but it was not only hers anymore. The sentence belonged to the building, to Eleanor, to Honora, to Silas, to the clerk's stamp, to the $10 bill, to the cold floor, to the first clean smoke, to the chickadee on the walnut branch, to Caleb's uneven sign. It belonged to all the waiting that had not been empty. She folded the unfinished letter and placed it in a drawer. Not hidden yet, only kept. There would be more to add. Years, perhaps? Repairs not yet imagined. Mistakes she had not yet made. Names she had not yet learned. Outside, the abandoned park had changed without becoming bright. The game stalls still leaned. The ticket booth still had no glass. The old miniature signs remained faded, but the service road was passable now, and the chain at the entrance had been rehung on a post that did not sag. In winter, smoke rose from the chimney. In spring, the walnut catkins returned. In summer, the marsh insects sang so loudly at dusk that the pavilion seemed to hum before the machinery ever moved. The Carousel Pavilion waits. It has always waited, not for applause, not for rescue by someone important, not for a photograph in a magazine or a crowd lined up with tickets in hand. It waits the way old work waits, for one careful hand then another, for the roof to be made sound before paint is praised, for a tool to be sharpened before a cut is attempted, for silence to become trust. And in the county clerk's office in Snow Hill, inside a cash drawer that still opened with a little catch on damp days, Alma Whitlock kept one taped $10 bill pressed flat beneath a paperweight shaped like the state of Maryland. She had entered the payment properly. The account was clean. The deed was filed. No rule required her to keep the bills separate. Still, she did. Sometimes, when a difficult person came to the counter for the right reason, Mrs. Whitlock would open the drawer, see the folded corner under the glass, and remember the morning a girl with a cardboard box bought a condemned pavilion nobody else wanted. She never told that story loudly. The best ones do not need it.